In the soft quiet of twilight, when the world seems to pause between day and night, we step back through the veil of centuries into a time when vast empires rose and fell with the sweep of history. Tonight, we turn our gaze eastward to the rise of one of the most enduring and complex empires the world has ever known. The Ottoman Empire, a dynasty of profound power and architectural elegance, of war horses and calligraphy, of crescent banners and golden domes, a realm that lasted more than 600 years, stretching across 3 continents and encompassing a mosaic of peoples, languages, and traditions. It is difficult to overstate the grandeur and reach of the Ottomans. From the sun-scorched deserts of Arabia to the cold frontiers of Central Europe, from the vineyards of Anatolia to the bustling ports of North Africa, the Ottomans stood as a bridge between worlds. They connected East and West, Islam and Christendom, tradition and modernity. Over 6 centuries, they ruled over Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Slavs, Jews, and countless others, not as a single people, but as a layered empire of many voices under the firm but intricate system of the Sublime Porte. Yet the Ottomans did not emerge fully formed from the pages of time. Their origins lie not in marble palaces or imperial capitals, but on the rugged steppes of Anatolia, where horsemen wandered between fading empires. They began not as emperors, but as warriors, frontier Ghazis who carried both the sword and the Quran. In this twilight world of collapsing realms and shifting borders, the Ottomans were forged from a mix of ambition, resilience, and opportunity. The story begins at the crossroads of history, a moment when the great powers of the medieval world were crumbling. The once mighty Seljuk Turks, who had ruled Anatolia and Persia, had fractured under Mongol invasions and internal feuds. Their remnants, weakened and divided, no longer held the firm grasp of authority they once did. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire, once the shining eastern half of Rome, was a shadow of its former glory. Reduced to a few cities and fortresses, locked in a slow retreat against waves of invaders and economic stagnation. And from the east, the Mongols had swept across Asia like a wildfire, their conquests leaving behind both ruin and power vacuums. In this fragile landscape, Anatolia, the land of ancient Troy and Byzantine cathedrals, became a fractured frontier. It was here, in the late 13th century, that a small Turkic principality emerged under the leadership of a man named Osman. His was a modest domain, one of many beyliks formed in the wake of the Seljuk collapse, but Osman's ambitions reached far beyond his borders. Guided by the warrior ethos of the Ghazi, holy warriors devoted to defending and expanding Islam, and by a vision of sovereignty rooted in both faith and pragmatism, Osman's tribe would lay the foundation for an empire that would endure into the 20th century. Over time, this small polity grew, absorbing rival principalities, confronting Byzantine strongholds, and establishing new systems of administration and military strength. What had begun as a confederation of horsemen gradually evolved into an imperial engine. The Ottomans adapted quickly, learning from the Persians, Arabs, Byzantines, and even their Mongol adversaries. Their strength came not merely from the sword, but from their ability to govern, to integrate, and to inspire loyalty across a diverse and sprawling dominion. The Ottomans were not just conquerors, they were builders, lawgivers, and philosophers. They raised mosques that touched the sky, enacted laws that balanced religious and secular authority, and cultivated a refined court culture that would come to rival that of the Abbasids or the Roman Caesars. In their palaces, miniature artists brushed ink onto silk, while in their markets, spices, silks, and ideas flowed from as far as India and Venice. Their janissaries, fierce infantrymen trained from childhood, marched in disciplined ranks, while their sultans debated theology and literature with scholars in the gardens of Topkapi. This, then, is the story of the Ottoman Empire, a story of beginnings and endings, of war and peace, of decline and renewal. It is a story not only of sultans and soldiers, but of weavers, poets, mothers, clerics, architects, and merchants. A story whispered through centuries, written in stone and parchment, and passed down through both triumph and tragedy. As we begin this journey, let the world of the Ottomans unfold softly before you, as gently as the call to prayer at dusk, as steady as the turning of a page. In the waning decades of the 13th century, Anatolia stood at a crossroads of collapse and possibility. Once the stronghold of the Byzantine Empire and a bastion of Seljuk Turkish power, it had become a fragmented quilt of competing principalities, faiths, and ambitions. The Mongol invasions had shattered the old order, scattering Seljuk authority like autumn leaves across the Anatolian plateau. Local warlords, tribal chiefs, and displaced peoples vied for territory and survival. The land groaned under political instability, and the villages between mountains and rivers witnessed more sword than song. It was in this volatile frontier world that a figure emerged, a man whose name would soon echo through history: Osman. Osman Fefs, the founder of what would become the Ottoman Empire, began not as a conqueror of empires, but as the leader of a small beylik, a Turkic principality nestled on the western edge of Anatolia, near the Byzantine borderlands. His father, Ertuğrul, had led a group of nomadic warriors loyal to the fading Seljuk sultans, and upon his death, Osman inherited both the responsibility of leadership and the uncertainty of a crumbling world. But Osman possessed something rare in an age of desperation: vision. While others saw only the ruins of empires, Osman saw opportunity. The chaos of Anatolia was both a curse and a chance. With the Byzantine Empire weakened and the Seljuks reduced to figureheads under Mongol suzerainty, Osman understood that the power vacuum could be filled not just by brute force, but by unity, charisma, and strategic calculation. His territory may have been modest, a few fortified towns and scattered villages, but it was well positioned. His lands bordered the fractured Byzantine holdings in Bithynia, and this proximity allowed for raids, alliances, and gradual expansion. Osman's ambitions were not born merely of conquest. He was deeply embedded in the spiritual and cultural ethos of the time. He embraced the identity of a Ghazi, a warrior for Islam, and framed his struggle as both temporal and divine. The Ghazi tradition was powerful in Anatolia's frontier culture, blending Sufi mysticism with martial values. These warriors fought not just to expand territory, but to uphold a sacred cause. Osman's Ghazis were drawn to him not just for loot or land, but for the promise of purpose. He cultivated loyalty by offering plunder, protection, and prestige to those who followed him. His small army became a brotherhood, disciplined, inspired, and increasingly formidable. Legends swirled around Osman's early leadership, and while many are likely embellished through the fog of time, they reflect the character his followers believed in. One such tale is the famous Dream of Osman, in which he supposedly saw a tree growing from his chest whose branches spread across the world, a divine symbol of future imperial grandeur. Whether literal or metaphorical, this vision underscored the scale of Osman's aspirations. He was not content to rule a mere beylik. He sought to forge something greater, a state that could endure, grow, and command respect. Osman began to consolidate power, absorbing neighboring Turkic tribes and forming military alliances. He was careful in his treatment of Christians in the region, often offering autonomy in exchange for tribute or loyalty. This pragmatic tolerance would become a hallmark of Ottoman governance. Meanwhile, he waged steady raids on nearby Byzantine fortresses, testing their defenses and expanding his influence with each successful campaign. His forces were light, mobile, and adaptive, suited for the rugged terrain and the unpredictable politics of the frontier. By the end of Osman's life, what had once been a minor principality had begun its transformation into a state. Though still relatively small in geographic scope, the foundations had been laid militarily, ideologically, and administratively. The seeds planted by Osman would bear fruit under his son Orhan and the generations that followed. Yet even in its early form, the Ottoman polity displayed a unique ability to blend martial prowess with spiritual vision, pragmatism with ambition. Osman I died around the year 1326, the same year his son captured Bursa, the first great Ottoman city. He would not live to see the heights his descendants would reach, but his legacy was sealed. From his modest beginnings, Osman had carved out more than territory. He had created a new identity, one that would grow into an empire of crescent moons and minarets, of laws and lances, of scholars and sultans. The story of Osman is the story of a world in transition, of how, from the ashes of fallen powers, a new force emerged. Not in grand palaces or gilded halls, but on the windswept plains of Anatolia, where a determined leader rode at the head of his warriors and quietly changed the course of history. To understand the world Osman I shaped and was shaped by, one must understand the ethos of the Ghazi, the warrior of faith. In the Anatolian frontier, where Christian Byzantines and Muslim Turkic principalities stood toe-to-toe, the concept of Gaza, holy warfare, offered not only spiritual validation, but also a practical framework for political and military expansion. The Ghazi was more than a swordsman. He was a servant of divine will, a figure who lived by the sword in pursuit of a just and sacred order. This was not jihad in the broader imperial sense, but a localized, frontier-style religious and political movement, deeply intertwined with Sufi orders and the tribal structures of the steppe. For Osman and his companions, the title of Ghazi became a badge of honor. It attracted warriors from all over the region, not just Muslims, but disillusioned Byzantine mercenaries, nomads looking for land and loot, and Sufis inspired by the promise of moral struggle. The frontier between the Byzantine and Turkic worlds became a fluid space, where identity was often more flexible than we imagine today. In this liminal zone, the Ghazi ethos gave Osman both legitimacy and recruits. The movement gave coherence to what could otherwise have been seen as simple raiding or tribal skirmishing. It elevated conquest into a spiritual calling and allowed Osman to attract a wider coalition of warriors united under a higher purpose. This spirit of faith-infused warfare also resonated deeply with the broader population. Villages weary of unstable rule and heavy taxation found the Ghazi lords to be more just and predictable. In exchange for military support or loyalty, many Christian communities were offered protection, autonomy, and lower taxes. Thus, the early Ottoman state was not built merely on the sword, but also on a reputation for practical fairness, another key component of the Ghazi tradition. The very name Ottoman carries the echo of this transformative period. It derives from Osman's name, which was rendered in Arabic as Uthman and in Turkish as Osman. His followers were known as the Osmanliler, or those of Osman. Over time, in Western tongues, this became Ottoman. It is a remarkable thing, an entire empire named after one man, who in his own lifetime could hardly have imagined the extent to which his name would travel. Unlike other Turkic dynasties named after tribes or vast regions, the Ottomans rooted their identity in the personal legacy of a leader. This personalization of the imperial brand added to its mystique and helped unify the state ideologically. Even centuries later, when sultans ruled over millions, the line of succession traced its legitimacy not just to titles or victories, but directly to the mythic charisma of Osman. His name, in this sense, became not only historical, but also symbolic, a banner beneath which empire, faith, and order were rallied. The early Ottoman chronicles would later embellish Osman's story, including tales of dreams, prophecy, and divine favor. These were more than just stories. They were instruments of legitimacy. In a world where rule was justified not by bureaucracy or elections, but by lineage, favor, and divine signs, these tales reinforced the idea that Osman's line had a destiny. With the ideological framework of the Gaza and the foundational charisma of Osman, the Ottomans began their slow but steady expansion. Their primary adversary at this early stage was the weakened Byzantine Empire, whose grip on Anatolia had grown increasingly tenuous. Local Byzantine lords held fortresses and cities, but many of them were isolated, poorly defended, and disconnected from Constantinople's dwindling resources. Osman and his successors exploited this vulnerability with patience and precision. Raids turned into sieges, and alliances were formed with other Turkic principalities or even disaffected Byzantine commanders. One of Osman's early victories was the capture of the fortress of Bilecik, a modest but symbolically significant prize. It demonstrated that Byzantine defenses were not impenetrable, and that the Ottomans had both the military acumen and the political dexterity to expand. From Bilecik, they moved on to Yenişehir, and then gradually pushed toward the more prominent city of Bursa, which would fall to Osman's son Orhan in 1326. But the Byzantines were not the only obstacles. Anatolia was filled with competing beyliks, fellow Turkic states that viewed the rise of Osman's power with suspicion. The Karamanids, Germanids, and others sometimes fought the Ottomans, other times allied with them, and often shifted loyalties depending on which way the wind blew. The Ottomans, however, had a few advantages. Their Ghazi ideology allowed them to unify disparate Turkic groups under a common banner. Their strategic marriages and diplomacy brought temporary peace where needed. And most importantly, their leaders, from Osman to Orhan, were capable of balancing the demands of warfare, governance, and vision. By the time Osman's direct rule ended, the Ottomans were no longer just a minor tribal power. They had grown into a regional force with a clear direction. What had begun as a mobile band of warriors was evolving into a settled state, capable of administration, taxation, and diplomacy. Their method of expansion was pragmatic. Fight when you must, negotiate when you can, absorb when it's wise. This slow and steady growth laid the foundation for one of the most enduring empires in human history. And though Osman did not live to see its full shape, he had lit the first spark, one born in the wild borderlands of Anatolia, where warriors of faith raised their swords not only in battle, but in belief that something greater could rise. After Osman I's passing, the reins of leadership passed smoothly to his son, Orhan Gazi, a transition that was both a testament to Osman's ability to consolidate power and a mark of the dynasty's growing stability. Orhan, unlike his father, was more than just a frontier warrior. He was a builder, a planner, and a tactician who envisioned the Ottoman Beylik not simply as a band of warriors, but as a burgeoning state with enduring institutions. The foundations Osman laid would now be fortified, systematized, and expanded. Orhan's reign, 1324 to 1362, brought about one of the most transformative moments in early Ottoman history, the capture of Bursa. Under his guidance, the Ottomans began to transition from a nomadic, tribal polity into a more structured administration. While Orhan certainly continued his father's Ghazi traditions, he also began integrating aspects of settled governance, appointing officials, standardizing practices, and laying the groundwork for the long administrative legacy that the Ottomans would be known for. Following Orhan, Murad I, r. 1362 to 1389, took the empire even further, ushering the Ottomans into the Balkans and establishing themselves as a significant transcontinental power. Murad was the first Ottoman ruler to style himself as Sultan, signaling a claim not just to tribal leadership but to sovereignty in the Islamic and imperial sense. Under Murad, the Ottomans became far more than a regional force. They became an empire in the making. His reign witnessed the institutionalization of key components of the Ottoman military and state, particularly the development of the Janissaries, which we'll discuss shortly, and the conquest of Edirne, a key European city that would serve as a secondary capital for over a century. Orhan and Murad I represented two sides of the Ottoman sword, one tempered with statecraft, the other sharpened on the battlefield. Together, their reigns created the crucial bridge between Osman's frontier raiding culture and the sophisticated imperial machine the Ottomans would later become. The fall of Bursa in 1326 was a defining event in Ottoman history. This once Byzantine city, nestled near the Sea of Marmara at the foot of Mount Uludağ, marked the Ottomans' first major urban conquest. It wasn't merely a military victory, it was symbolic. Bursa was a prosperous, well-fortified city with rich agricultural lands, vibrant marketplaces, and strategic access to trade routes. Its fall signaled that the Ottomans were no longer a roaming military band. They now possessed an urban center from which to govern, trade, and grow. Osman didn't live to see its capture, but his son Orhan completed the siege after several years of blockade and negotiation. The conquest was relatively bloodless, a calculated show of strength mixed with political patience. Once inside, Orhan established Bursa as the Ottoman capital. It was here that the first clear elements of Ottoman governance emerged: a court structure, a nascent bureaucracy, and the beginnings of architectural patronage that would blossom in later centuries. Bursa became more than a political center. It was a cultural and economic hub. The Ottomans built mosques, madrasas, markets, and baths. The city became a center for silk production, contributing to the Ottoman economy and integrating them into broader Eurasian trade networks. And spiritually, it gained importance as the burial place of Osman and Orhan, turning it into a dynastic and sacred city. The fall of Bursa marked the Ottomans' full entry into settled rule. With the city as a base, their ambitions could now stretch further, across the Bosphorus and into Europe. One of the quiet revolutions of Orhan's reign was the institutionalization of governance. Warfare may have brought territory, but it was administration that would sustain an empire. Under Orhan, the Ottomans began minting their own coins, a powerful symbol of sovereignty and legitimacy. These silver coins, stamped with Orhan's name, were a declaration to the world. The Ottomans were not simply vassals or raiders, they were rulers in their own right. The economic reforms went beyond coinage. Orhan established a taxation system to extract revenue in an organized manner. Land was surveyed and categorized, and taxes were collected in kind and coin, wheat, barley, livestock, or silver. This not only stabilized the treasury, but also created a system of accountability between ruler and subject. Taxation, though never welcome, was administered with a level of predictability that brought a kind of order and, in turn, trust. The early Ottoman administration was pragmatic. It borrowed heavily from Byzantine and Seljuk practices, adapting them to suit a growing and ethnically diverse population. For instance, Christian subjects were allowed to retain local leaders under the millet system's early precursor, allowing coexistence and ensuring compliance without rebellion. Islamic law, Sharia, coexisted with customary and administrative law, Kanun, setting a precedent for the legal duality the Ottomans would later master. Military administration was also systematized. The creation of the Janissaries, a corps of elite infantry drawn from converted Christian boys through the Devshirme system, began under Orhan and solidified under Murad I. These troops would become the backbone of the Ottoman army, loyal only to the Sultan, and instrumental in the expansion across Europe. From the capture of Bursa to the establishment of systems that governed everything from coin minting to military recruitment, the early Ottomans were laying the stonework of an empire. What began in tents and fortresses was now being etched into marble and law. The sword had brought them here, but it was bureaucracy, coinage, and careful statecraft that would allow them to remain, and eventually to rise. As the Ottoman Empire began to stretch beyond its Anatolian roots, it faced new challenges, maintaining loyalty across diverse populations, commanding larger and more organized military campaigns, and developing institutions that could support a fast-growing state. One of the most extraordinary and enduring innovations born of this period was the creation of the Janissary Corps and the accompanying Devshirme system. These were not merely military solutions, but the early seeds of a centralized imperial identity that would endure for centuries. The Janissaries, meaning Yeniçeri or new soldiers in Ottoman Turkish, were an elite infantry unit that would become synonymous with the power of the Ottoman military machine. Unlike tribal warriors bound by family loyalties or regional ties, the Janissaries were servants of the Sultan alone. Their strength lay not only in their discipline and training, but also in their origin. This origin was the devshirme system, a deeply strategic, if controversial, practice that began during the reign of Murad I. Through the devshirme, Christian boys, primarily from the Balkans, were taken from their families, usually aged between 8 and 18, and brought to Istanbul. There, they were converted to Islam, trained rigorously in military and administrative disciplines, and taught unwavering loyalty to the Sultan. While modern perspectives often view this system through a critical lens of coercion and cultural loss, in its time, the devshirme was also seen as a pathway to power and social mobility. Many of these boys rose to occupy the most prestigious positions in the Ottoman court, including Grand Vizier, military commanders, and governors. They became the inner circle of the empire's power structure, loyal not to tribe or region, but to the state itself. The Janissaries, once trained, were disciplined soldiers unlike any the medieval world had seen. They were not allowed to marry, engage in trade, or own property during their service, ensuring their focus remained solely on their duties. Their uniforms were standardized, their weapons advanced, and their reputation unmatched. Over time, they would evolve from a symbol of military excellence into a political force of their own. But in these early days, they were the backbone of Ottoman expansion. Through the Janissary Corps and the devshirme system, the Ottomans created a military elite that embodied the empire's pragmatism, blending diversity, hierarchy, and Islamic principles with strategic innovation. It was this corps that led the charge into Europe, setting the stage for some of the most pivotal battles in Ottoman history. By the late 14th century, the Ottomans were no longer a regional Anatolian power. They had crossed into Europe, claiming cities, forging alliances, and drawing the wary eyes of established Christian kingdoms. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 marked both a culmination and a turning point in the empire's European ambitions. Murad I, now seasoned with years of expansion, led his forces deep into the Balkans, where they encountered a coalition of Serbian and Bosnian nobles under Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović. Kosovo Polje, the Field of Blackbirds, would become one of the most mythologized battlefields in Balkan and Ottoman memory. On its surface, the battle was tactically inconclusive, with both leaders, Murad and Lazar, perishing during or shortly after the fighting. Yet its aftermath sent a clear signal. The Ottomans were here to stay. The battle unfolded in waves of cavalry charges, archery skirmishes, and brutal melee fighting. Ottoman forces, structured and reinforced by the Janissaries, held the line and eventually outlasted the Balkan coalition. Murad I was reportedly killed by a Serbian noble who had infiltrated the camp under the pretense of diplomacy, a dramatic tale that lives on in both Turkish and Serbian lore. Following Murad's death, his son Bayezid I assumed command directly on the battlefield, a smooth transition that demonstrated the growing organizational strength of the Ottoman state. Bayezid quickly solidified control and began an even more aggressive expansion into Europe, earning the nickname Yildirim, or the Thunderbolt, for his speed and decisiveness. The significance of the Battle of Kosovo transcends its immediate military outcome. For the Ottomans, it marked the beginning of firm control over much of the Balkans. Serbian vassalage followed, and soon the empire began absorbing Bulgaria, Albania, and parts of Greece. The Ottomans' presence in Europe was no longer experimental. It was entrenched. For Balkan peoples, the battle became a symbol of resistance, martyrdom, and cultural memory. It is commemorated in epic poetry, religious ceremony, and national mythology. In Serbia, Kosovo became synonymous with both tragedy and heroism, a legacy that echoes even in modern political discourse. Yet, from the calm, measured vantage point of history, the battle also illustrates the Ottoman genius for expansion, not merely through force, but through integration. After the battle, local rulers were often allowed to remain in power under Ottoman suzerainty, provided they paid tribute and remained loyal. This allowed for a relatively peaceful consolidation of territory and reduced the need for continual military occupation. By the end of the 14th century, the Ottoman Empire stood poised as a transcontinental power, straddling Anatolia and southeastern Europe, backed by a fearsome new military elite and governed by a growing administrative sophistication. The foundation laid by Osman and expanded by Orhan and Murad was now a staircase to empire, one step at a time, one province at a time, leading inevitably toward the conquest of Constantinople. But that chapter, rich with siege towers and cannons, still lay on the horizon. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a mere frontier state. Under the leadership of Bayezid I, son of Murad I, the empire surged forward with a speed and ferocity that stunned its neighbors. Nicknamed Yildirim, meaning the thunderbolt, Bayezid was known not only for his swiftness on the battlefield, but for the rapid pace at which he expanded the empire's reach. Bayezid's rise to power was as dramatic as his reign. He assumed command immediately after the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, where his father had been slain. In a time when succession could invite chaos, Bayezid's swift consolidation of power demonstrated his sharp political instincts. Almost immediately, he began campaigning across both Europe and Anatolia, extending Ottoman control deeper into the Balkans and asserting dominance over the fragmented Turkish beyliks to the east. In the Balkans, Bayezid continued his predecessor's policies of vassalage and conquest. He decisively defeated the remaining Serbian principalities, pushing as far north as Hungary. His forces captured Sofia and Niš, fortifying Ottoman control of key trade and military routes through the region. His confrontations with Wallachian ruler Mircea the Elder proved more difficult, but even there, Bayezid managed to assert nominal control, demanding tribute from the Wallachians after hard-fought campaigns. In Anatolia, Bayezid's ambitions were even more aggressive. He set his sights on the Turkish beyliks, small principalities that had emerged after the decline of the Seljuks. These were ruled by Turkic dynasties with roots similar to the Ottomans, and their independence was both a political threat and a challenge to Bayezid's legitimacy. In a series of military campaigns, he brought many of these beyliks under Ottoman control, centralizing Anatolia in a way no previous sultan had achieved. Among these were the Karamanids and Germianids, who were either defeated outright or coerced into submission. Bayezid's actions reflected a shift in Ottoman identity. Where once the empire had grown as a coalition of frontier warriors, now it was transforming into a centralized imperial force. He appointed governors, reformed tax systems, and standardized coinage, all of which served to strengthen the empire's bureaucratic framework. He also took steps to further entwine the Ottoman Sultanate with Islamic authority. Bayezid received recognition from the Abbasid Caliph in Cairo, who bestowed upon him the title of Sultan of Rum, cementing his position as both a political and spiritual leader in the Islamic world. This helped legitimize Ottoman authority not only in Muslim lands, but also among the Muslim populations of newly conquered Christian territories. Bayezid's rule seemed unstoppable. The Ottoman domains stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates, and the empire appeared poised to take the next monumental step, capturing Constantinople. The city of Constantinople, seat of the Byzantine Empire, had long been the symbolic and strategic prize for the Ottomans. Surrounded by Ottoman territory and weakened by centuries of internal strife and external pressures, the city remained a resilient outpost of Christian resistance and imperial heritage. In 1394, Bayezid I set his sights on this long-coveted jewel. He launched a siege that would last several years, from 1394 to 1402, with varying degrees of intensity. The goal was not just military conquest, but psychological dominance. Encircling the city, Bayezid constructed fortresses on either side of the Bosphorus to cut off supplies and force the Byzantines into submission. Yet the siege proved more difficult than expected. The walls of Constantinople were legendary, thick, tall, and virtually impenetrable with the siege technologies of the time. The Ottomans lacked the heavy artillery that would later be used by Mehmed II in 1453. Moreover, the Byzantines received aid from Christian Europe. A crusading army, largely composed of French and Hungarian forces, marched to relieve the city and engage the Ottomans at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. Though Bayezid crushed the Crusaders in a decisive victory, the external support for Constantinople did enough to keep the city from falling. The siege became a war of attrition. Bayezid maintained pressure on the city while continuing campaigns elsewhere. He summoned Christian vassals from the Balkans to participate in military campaigns against Wallachia and Hungary, further consolidating his authority across southeastern Europe. Yet, despite these efforts, the siege stagnated. Then a new threat emerged, not from the west, but from the east. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, was building an empire of his own, stretching from Central Asia into Persia and beyond. Timur viewed Bayezid's expansion as a provocation and a rival claim to Islamic leadership. As Bayezid tightened his grip on Constantinople, Timur moved into Anatolia. This confrontation would soon erupt into one of the most significant events in early Ottoman history, disrupting everything Bayezid had built and plunging the empire into a period of chaos and civil war. The failed siege of Constantinople was not just a missed opportunity, it was a turning point. The empire, which had been ascending like thunder across 2 continents, was about to be struck by lightning from the east. In the summer of 1402, a confrontation unfolded that would reshape the Ottoman Empire's destiny. The once unstoppable Bayezid I, the Thunderbolt, found himself face to face with Timur, the brilliant and ruthless Central Asian warlord whose empire stretched from the Indus to the Caucasus. The stage was set for the Battle of Ankara, a cataclysmic clash that would halt Ottoman expansion and plunge the state into a dark and uncertain decade. Timur, also known as Tamerlane, viewed Bayezid not only as a rival, but as a threat to his vision of supremacy over the Islamic world. Both men laid claim to leadership over the fractured remains of the Seljuk and Mongol legacies. Their conflict was not merely political, it was personal, strategic, and ideological. When Bayezid annexed eastern Anatolian beyliks that Timur considered part of his sphere, war became inevitable. The two armies met near Ankara in July 1402. Bayezid brought with him a sizable force, including contingents from his Balkan vassals. But Timur's army was larger, more experienced, and included fearsome cavalry from the steppes, as well as elephants from his campaigns in India. Despite Bayezid's reputation for rapid assaults, Timur demonstrated masterful patience and control. He used hit-and-run tactics, cut off the Ottomans' water supplies in the Anatolian summer heat, and even succeeded in encouraging defections among Turkish contingents who once belonged to the beyliks Bayezid had conquered. The battle quickly turned into a rout. Bayezid's formations collapsed under relentless pressure. Chaos reigned among the Ottomans, and Bayezid himself was captured, an unprecedented humiliation for a reigning Ottoman sultan. Legend has it that Timur, though respectful in tone, kept Bayezid in a gilded cage, a potent symbol of the fallen ruler's fate. The Battle of Ankara was not simply a military loss. It was a profound shock to the empire's foundations. Bayezid's once cohesive realm shattered overnight. The Balkan territories, held together through vassalage and fear, sensed weakness and began asserting autonomy. The Anatolian beyliks, newly conquered and resentful, reasserted independence. And most critically, the Ottomans had no clear line of succession. With Bayezid imprisoned, his sons turned on one another. Following the disaster at Ankara, the empire descended into a period of chaos known as the Ottoman Interregnum, 1402 to 1413. With Bayezid incapacitated and later dead, his sons Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed each staked a claim to the throne. What followed was more than a dynastic feud. It was a civil war that fractured the empire both geographically and politically. Suleiman established himself in Edirne, Adrianople, controlling the European provinces. Isa took Bursa, the Ottoman capital in Anatolia. Musa initially supported Suleiman but later turned against him, and Mehmed set up a power base in Amasya in northeastern Anatolia. Each brother sought allies, Christian and Muslim alike, offering titles and territory in exchange for support. This period saw shifting allegiances, sieges, and assassinations. Cities like Bursa and Edirne changed hands more than once. The once centralized Ottoman administration splintered, and rival courts emerged, each issuing orders, collecting taxes, and minting coins. Trade routes suffered, peasant communities were disrupted, and the imperial momentum was lost. Yet amidst this chaos, Mehmed I gradually distinguished himself. He consolidated his rule in Anatolia through a mix of diplomacy and decisive military action. While his brothers bled their armies in the west, Mehmed built strength and legitimacy. He refrained from overextending himself and carefully nurtured alliances among former beyliks and provincial leaders. By 1413, Mehmed launched a campaign to defeat his final rival, his brother Musa, who had by then seized control in the Balkans. At the Battle of Çamurlu near Sofia, Mehmed triumphed. Musa was killed, and with his death, the civil war came to an end. After more than a decade of fragmentation, the Ottoman realm was unified once again under a single ruler. Mehmed I, often referred to as the second founder of the Ottoman Empire, took the throne not through birthright alone, but by surviving and prevailing in one of the most perilous eras in Ottoman history. His reign, 1413 to 1421, was not one of grand conquest, but of patient restoration. He re-established the imperial bureaucracy, restored trust in the central government, and began rebuilding relations with both the Balkan vassals and the Anatolian provinces. Mehmed recognized that the survival of the empire depended not only on military power, but on the ability to unify diverse groups under a shared imperial vision. He reaffirmed ties with key Muslim institutions, ensured the smooth collection of taxes, and carefully reintegrated rebellious regions. In some areas, he practiced clemency. In others, he used force. But always, he aimed to reforge what had been broken. Though the scars of the Interregnum remained, Mehmed's efforts laid the foundation for a renewed Ottoman resurgence. He moved carefully, allowing his son Murad II a relatively stable realm to inherit. Mehmed the Fa'i may not be as celebrated as Mehmed the Conqueror or Suleiman the Magnificent, but without his steady hand, the Ottoman story might have ended before it truly began. In many ways, it was through quiet restoration, not thunderous conquest, that the empire found its path forward again. The mid-15th century was a time of anticipation, with empires old and new holding their breath across the Mediterranean world. It was into this moment of tension that Mehmed II ascended the Ottoman throne in 1451, at just 19 years old. His father, Murad II, had passed after a reign of relative consolidation, leaving Mehmed with a stable yet unfulfilled vision, the long-standing Ottoman desire to conquer Constantinople, the legendary city of emperors, churches, and ancient walls. Though young, Mehmed was no novice. He had already briefly ruled during one of his father's abdications and had spent his childhood immersed in both military training and the philosophies of governance. Fluent in several languages, including Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin, Mehmed was a scholar, a strategist, and a ruler who believed deeply in destiny. The old Byzantine capital, long surrounded but never taken, stood like a challenge history had laid out just for him. Constantinople, by then a diminished echo of its former glory, remained a potent symbol. Once the seat of Roman emperors and the heart of Eastern Christendom, the city had endured for over 1,000 years. But now, in the 1450s, it was a shadow of its imperial self. Under the rule of Emperor Constantine XI, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to little more than the capital and a few outlying territories. Still, its prestige, spiritual authority, and geographic position made it the most coveted prize in the region. Mehmed understood this, and he approached the task with methodical precision. He began by securing his empire's flanks, reaffirming truces with Venice and Hungary, thus reducing the chance of a multi-front conflict. Then he focused inward, reorganizing the army, gathering siege engineers, and constructing the massive fortress of Rumeli Hisar, also known as the Fortress of Europe, on the Bosphorus western bank. This new structure sat directly across from the older Anadolu Hisar, giving the Ottomans full control over the strait. Constantinople was, quite literally, being encircled. In April 1453, Mehmed launched his final move, a full-scale siege of Constantinople. He brought with him an army of an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 troops, including janissaries, cavalry, engineers, and sappers. One of his most critical advantages, however, was technological. He had commissioned the construction of massive cannons, including the legendary basilica, built by the Hungarian engineer Orban. This was one of the largest bombards the world had seen, capable of hurling stone projectiles weighing over half a ton at the city's ancient walls. The defenders, numbering fewer than 10,000 under Emperor Constantine XI, were courageous but severely outmatched. They relied on the city's triple walls, once impenetrable, and the legendary chain that blocked the entrance to the Golden Horn, the inlet protecting the northern side of the city. But Mehmed was prepared for both. His artillery began pounding the walls relentlessly, day after day, while his navy, bolstered by new shipbuilding programs, pressed against the sea defenses. Perhaps most famously, when faced with the blockage of the Golden Horn, Mehmed ordered his men to drag ships overland on greased wooden tracks to bypass the chain and launch a naval assault from the north. It was a move of staggering audacity and strategic brilliance, startling both allies and enemies. The siege lasted for 53 days. As food and hope dwindled inside Constantinople, outside the walls, Mehmed's forces maintained relentless pressure. On May 29, 1453, after several days of intensified bombardment, Mehmed launched a final, massive assault. His elite janissaries broke through a breach in the walls near the gate of St. Romanus. Inside the city, chaos erupted. Emperor Constantine XI is said to have cast off his imperial regalia and died fighting alongside his men, a final, tragic symbol of the Byzantine end. Ottoman troops poured in, and though there were instances of looting and violence, Mehmed quickly reasserted control. He entered the city with a profound sense of ceremony, walking through the gates not as a destroyer, but as a sovereign. One of his first acts was to ride to the Hagia Sophia, the crowning jewel of Byzantine architecture. There he instructed that it be converted into a mosque, yet preserved as a sacred space. He allowed the Christian population to remain and appointed a new patriarch, symbolizing his role as protector, not eradicator, of the city's diverse faiths. The conquest of Constantinople was more than a military triumph. It marked the true emergence of the Ottomans as an imperial power, uniting Europe and Asia, Islam and Christianity, ancient and modern. Mehmed II was henceforth known as Fatih, the Conqueror. He made the city his capital, renamed it Istanbul, though this name wouldn't become official until centuries later, and began transforming it into the beating heart of an empire that would shape global history for centuries to come. What Mehmed achieved in 1453 was not only the fulfillment of an Ottoman dream, but the closing of a chapter in classical history and the opening of a new age, one in which East and West were no longer divided by a wall of stone, but merged through the vision of an empire reborn. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 did not mark the end of a city. It marked its transformation. For Mehmed II, now crowned the Conqueror, the city was not merely a spoil of war. It was to be the seat of his empire, the symbol of a new Ottoman identity and the bridge between East and West. He did not raze it to the ground, he raised it to new glory. From its Byzantine bones, Mehmed would build the capital of one of history's most enduring empires, what would eventually be called Istanbul. In the days following the conquest, the city lay scarred. The population was scattered, many churches had been looted or abandoned, and entire districts were depopulated. Mehmed understood that a capital could not be a ghost town. He immediately issued orders to repopulate the city. Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across the empire were encouraged, sometimes even compelled, to settle in the new capital. Greek Orthodox patriarchates, Armenian bishops, and Jewish rabbis were all invited to establish their communities anew under the protection of the Sultan. This inclusivity was not merely a gesture of goodwill, it was a foundational pillar of Ottoman governance. By incorporating multiple religions into a unified imperial system, Mehmed created a framework where diversity was not just tolerated, it was organized. Each religious group was granted autonomy through the millet system. These millets were responsible for governing their own internal affairs, laws, marriages, education, and worship, so long as they pledged loyalty to the Sultan and paid taxes. Thus, religious tolerance in Istanbul was less about modern secular ideals and more about imperial pragmatism. Mehmed was deeply devout, but he believed that an empire could not thrive on religious homogeny. Instead, a centralized authority over a multi-ethnic, multi-faith population required careful balance, firm political control at the top, and delegated cultural autonomy at the community level. To administer this balance, Mehmed embarked on a massive project of centralization. He established the Imperial Council, Divan, as the executive branch of government, placing the Grand Vizier at its head and embedding within it various departments overseeing finance, military, and justice. The city itself was restructured administratively, divided into quarters, each managed by a local representative answerable to the Sultan's court. Taxes were streamlined, land registries were created, and the currency was stabilized to encourage trade. But perhaps nowhere was Mehmed's vision more visible than in the physical transformation of the city itself. He understood that architecture was more than just stone and mortar. It was a political language, a way to write power across the landscape. Under his reign, construction flourished. Old Byzantine structures were repaired, while new Ottoman landmarks rose to signal the empire's permanence. Most notably, the Hagia Sophia, once the grandest church of the Eastern Roman Empire, was converted into a mosque. But rather than demolishing its Christian artistry, Mehmed ordered that much of the original architecture be preserved. Islamic features such as minarets, a mihrab, and calligraphic panels were added, but the Christian mosaics were, in many cases, simply plastered over rather than destroyed. This duality, where sacred spaces could evolve rather than be erased, became a hallmark of Istanbul's urban identity. Alongside religious buildings, Mehmed commissioned the construction of the Fatih Mosque complex, named in honor of his new title. This was more than a place of prayer. It included a school, library, hospital, and soup kitchen, setting a template for later imperial mosques. Such complexes embodied the Ottoman ideal of social responsibility. Architecture was not only for grandeur, but for service. Legally, Mehmed took major steps toward codifying and modernizing the empire's judicial framework. While Islamic Sharia remained the bedrock of religious law, he developed a complementary body of secular regulations known as Kanun. These laws governed areas not covered by Sharia, such as taxation, land tenure, and criminal punishment. The synthesis of Kanun and Sharia allowed the state to operate efficiently without overstepping religious doctrine. This dual legal system reflected Mehmed's broader strategy to preserve the religious legitimacy of the caliphate while building the machinery of a modern imperial state. Judges, qadis, were appointed to cities throughout the empire, and a hierarchy of legal appeals was established, culminating in the Sultan himself as the supreme judicial authority. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul was thus more than a change of name. It was a reinvention. Mehmed II did not erase the past. He absorbed it, reconfigured it, and reimagined it under a new flag. The city became a mirror of the empire itself, layered, complex, inclusive, and authoritative. In the centuries that followed, Istanbul would become not just a capital, but a cultural magnet, a city where Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Greek, Armenian, and Ladino were spoken in the same market, where Orthodox priests and Muslim imams shared the same skyline, where caravan traders, scholars, and pilgrims passed through on their way to the edge of the known world. And it all began with a 19-year-old ruler who saw not ruins, but potential. Mehmed II's transformation of the city was not a footnote to conquest. It was the empire's first true expression of who the Ottomans would become, a fusion of past and future, a crossroads of worlds, a legacy, quite literally, set in stone. When Suleiman ascended the Ottoman throne in 1520, he inherited an already formidable empire, but over the course of his 46-year reign, he would elevate it to its absolute zenith. Known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent, and in the Islamic world as Suleiman the Lawgiver, Kanuni, he became a ruler whose legacy embodied the peak of Ottoman power, cultural flourishing, and legal reform. His reign was not only the longest in Ottoman history, but also arguably the most influential, shaping the empire's character for generations to come. At just 26 years old, Suleiman took the throne with quiet assurance. His upbringing had been steeped in both martial training and humanist learning. He was a polyglot, fluent in Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and even Chagatai. He had also studied philosophy, history, poetry, and the law, and was deeply interested in architecture and theology. This unique blend of warrior and statesman would define his rule. But before he could reform and enrich the empire from within, Suleiman turned his attention outward. His military campaigns were swift, strategic, and transformative, expanding Ottoman borders deeper into Europe and asserting dominance across land and sea. In 1521, just a year after his accession, he launched a campaign against the Kingdom of Hungary and captured Belgrade, a critical fortress on the Danube that had previously resisted Ottoman efforts under Mehmed II. The conquest of Belgrade marked a significant shift in European-Ottoman relations. It signaled the Ottomans' serious intent to penetrate further into Christian Europe. The fortress had been considered one of Christendom's last bastions, and its fall caused considerable anxiety among European monarchs and the papacy alike. But for Suleiman, it was just the beginning. In 1522, he turned south toward the island of Rhodes, held by the Knights Hospitaller. The siege of Rhodes was a monumental endeavor, lasting 5 months. The Knights were renowned for their tenacity, and the fortified island had long been a thorn in the side of Ottoman shipping in the eastern Mediterranean. Suleiman's forces, through sheer endurance and superior siege tactics, eventually forced the Knights to surrender. He allowed them to evacuate honorably, a gesture that earned him both respect and political advantage in a world governed as much by ritual as by blood. But it was in 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, that Suleiman delivered one of his most decisive military victories. The Kingdom of Hungary stood as a major European power and a bulwark between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. At Mohacs, Suleiman's forces met the Hungarian army on the floodplain of the Danube. The battle was brief, lasting barely 2 hours, but catastrophic for the Hungarians. Their army was crushed, King Louis II was killed in retreat, and the kingdom itself was split, with much of it falling under Ottoman control and the rest contested between pro-Ottoman and Habsburg factions. Mohacs was not just a military victory, it was a psychological blow to Christian Europe. The speed and scale of the defeat stunned the continent. It dismantled the last strong, centralized monarchy between the Ottomans and the heart of Europe. More than that, it marked the beginning of a century-long Ottoman presence in Hungary, a key foothold from which future campaigns would be launched. Suleiman's dominance on land was matched by Ottoman naval superiority. Though this section focuses on his military campaigns in Europe, it's important to note that during his reign, commanders like Hayreddin Barbarossa transformed the Ottoman fleet into the dominant force in the Mediterranean. From the western coasts of North Africa to the gates of Vienna, the empire's influence surged. Unlike many conquerors, however, Suleiman did not let military glory define him entirely. These victories provided the stability and prestige necessary for him to launch a series of profound administrative and cultural reforms, topics explored in the next section of this chapter. Yet, even in the context of his martial triumphs, Suleiman's approach was as much about diplomacy as it was about force. He maintained correspondence with Francis I of France, balancing the Habsburgs with a European alliance that was as strategic as it was unconventional. In an age of religious absolutism, this Muslim-Christian diplomacy was unusual but remarkably effective. Suleiman's early campaigns expanded not only the borders of the Ottoman Empire, but also its confidence. His reign, defined by these early triumphs, ushered in what many historians consider the true golden age of Ottoman history. From the smoky battlefield at Mohacs to the granite ramparts of Rhodes and the echoing halls of Belgrade, the empire's reach became tangible, etched across maps and whispered in fear by European courts. But for Suleiman, conquest was just the beginning. His next campaign would be against disorder, injustice, and the limitations of human institutions themselves. As the cannons quieted and the borders widened, the Sultan turned inward, to laws, to art, to legacy. The sword had cleared the path. Now, the pen would write the story. While Suleiman's dominance on land was undeniable, it was on the waters of the Mediterranean that his empire established an equally powerful legacy. At the heart of this naval supremacy stood a legendary figure, Hayreddin Barbarossa, born Khizr Reis. With a red beard, unmatched maritime skill, and unshakable loyalty to the Sultan, Barbarossa transformed the Ottoman navy into one of the most feared and respected fleets in the world. Hayreddin's journey to power was as adventurous as the empire he served. Alongside his brother Arouj, also a famed corsair, he had operated independently across the Mediterranean, attacking Spanish ships, defending Muslim refugees expelled from Iberia, and establishing control over parts of North Africa. After Arouj's death, Khizr pledged allegiance to the Ottomans and was granted the name Hayreddin by Suleiman, meaning best of the faith. Soon after, he was appointed Capitan Pasha, or Grand Admiral, placing the entire Ottoman fleet under his command. Under Barbarossa, the Ottomans asserted dominance in key naval theatres. In 1538, his most famous victory came at the Battle of Preveza, where a combined fleet of Holy League forces, comprising ships from Venice, the Papal States, Spain and others, was utterly defeated by Barbarossa's fleet. This clash ensured Ottoman control over much of the eastern Mediterranean for decades. The Ottomans didn't just dominate trade routes. They projected imperial power onto the seas in a way few Muslim empires ever had. Barbarossa's legacy was more than military. He established dockyards, improved naval logistics, and ensured that Ottoman maritime routes stretched from Algiers to the Red Sea. Through him, Suleiman's empire could defend Muslim pilgrimage routes to Mecca, support allies in North Africa, and challenge Christian naval powers across the Mediterranean. In a world where naval control equated to economic lifelines and prestige, Barbarossa was the Sultan's sword on water. And while the oceans echoed with cannon fire, back on land, Suleiman was sharpening another tool of empire: law. He was not merely a conqueror or a patron of the arts, he was above all a lawgiver. His nickname in the Islamic world, Kanuni Suleiman, Suleiman the lawgiver, reflected a core legacy that extended beyond military triumphs. Suleiman's legal reforms were not born from idealism alone, but from necessity. As the empire expanded rapidly in size and diversity, so too did its challenges. How could one legal system manage the needs of Turks, Arabs, Slavs, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews spread across 3 continents and numerous faiths? The answer lay in a carefully crafted synthesis of religious and secular law. The Islamic world was already governed by Sharia, the divine law based on the Quran and the Hadith. But Suleiman recognized that Sharia did not address every administrative or civil concern in a vast, complex empire. To fill these gaps, he codified and expanded a parallel set of laws known as Kanun, imperial edicts based on custom, precedent, and statecraft. While Sharia governed matters of personal faith, marriage, and religious obligations, Kanun provided structure for taxation, criminal justice, land tenure, and military obligations. This dual system allowed for flexibility while retaining religious legitimacy. The Sultan worked closely with the Sheikhul Islam, the highest Islamic cleric in the empire, to ensure harmony between the 2 codes. Kanun never contradicted Sharia, but instead complemented it, filling in the blanks where divine guidance was silent. Suleiman's legal reforms brought predictability to taxation, helped regulate the responsibilities of governors, and clarified laws around inheritance and commerce. The reforms weren't limited to the Muslim population either. The empire's millet system, which allowed Christians and Jews to govern many of their own affairs under their own religious laws, was reinforced under his rule, ensuring a degree of autonomy and peace among diverse subjects. Through these efforts, Suleiman professionalized governance. Judges, qadis, were appointed with clear guidelines, and corruption was punished. The law became a tool not just of control, but of justice, one that could be seen as fair across a multicultural population. Merchants, farmers, soldiers, and even slaves could, in theory, appeal to the law for redress. In many ways, this blending of Sharia and Kanun mirrored the dual nature of Suleiman's empire, rooted in Islamic tradition but open to the pragmatic needs of administration. It offered a rare balance: stability without stagnation, tradition without rigidity. Thus, even as Suleiman's armies triumphed in Hungary and his navy ruled the Aegean, his legal structures ensured that the empire did not crumble under its own weight. The power of law kept the provinces connected, the governors accountable, and the people, whether Muslim or not, feeling part of a greater order. Barbarossa had built an empire on the seas. Suleiman had anchored it in law, and together these pillars would uphold the Ottoman world at its strongest, a realm as vast and complex as any before it, yet somehow held together by parchment, principle, and power. Suleiman's military victories and legal genius were only half of the story. Behind the marble screens of Topkapi Palace, another transformation unfolded, one woven through silken corridors, whispered counsel, and an unexpected love that would alter court politics forever. Around 1530, the Sultan made a choice unprecedented in Ottoman tradition. He freed and lawfully married one of his harem concubines, a woman remembered to history as Harem Sultan, or Roxelana. Harem's origins lay far from Istanbul's domes. Born Alexandra Lisovska in what is now western Ukraine, she was captured by Crimean Tatars and eventually entered the imperial harem. There, her quick wit, multilingual skills, and lively humor captivated Suleiman. Custom dictated that a concubine who bore the Sultan a son would never again share his bed, ensuring each valiant mother wielded limited influence. Hürrem broke that convention entirely. After giving Suleiman multiple children, including the future Selim II, she not only remained his favored companion, but became his legal wife, a privilege no concubine had been granted in centuries. Her position reshaped palace dynamics. At court, the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, had traditionally been the harem's highest authority. In time, Hürrem would rival and then eclipse that power, guiding marriage alliances, charity endowments, and diplomatic correspondence. European ambassadors reported with surprise that a former slave now exchanged letters with kings and negotiated truces. Within the empire, conservative voices muttered at the break with precedent, yet Suleiman's affection never cooled. Hürrem's influence was neither purely political nor purely personal. She spearheaded monumental public works projects, a women's hospital in Jerusalem, soup kitchens in Mecca and Medina, and a grand mosque complex in Istanbul that still bears her name, Haseki Hürrem Sultan Külliyesi. Each endowment showcased a vision of piety, married to social welfare, reinforcing the dynasty's legitimacy among subjects from Cairo to the Crimea. The marriage also deepened the phenomenon historians later called the Sultanate of Women, a century-long stretch when imperial consorts and queen mothers exerted extraordinary sway, while male heirs jostled for succession and viziers schemed in council halls. A parallel politics unfolded behind lattice windows. Eunuchs served as intermediaries, petitions flowed through embroidered cushions, and decisions that shaped provinces often emerged from seemingly private quarters. In this delicate ballet, Hürrem danced with unmatched poise, ensuring her son's futures and imprinting compassion projects across the realm. Yet, love stories do not an empire sustain alone. Suleiman's Istanbul blossomed into one of the early modern world's radiant cultural capitals, and Hürrem's patronage formed just one thread in a larger tapestry. At the Sultan's command, a young architect named Sinan, once a Christian boy conscripted through the Devshirme levy, rose to become Mimar Sinan, chief royal architect. Over 5 decades, he designed more than 300 structures, aqueducts that delivered sweet water, bridges that stitched provinces, and above all, mosques whose cascading domes redefined skyline aesthetics. His Shehzade Mosque honored Suleiman's beloved son Mehmed, His Süleymaniye Mosque crowned one of Istanbul's 7 hills like a stone hymn. Mathematical precision met mystical aspiration, bathing worshippers in shafts of light that seemed to dissolve earthly weight. Alongside stone arts came miniature painting. The Nakashain, imperial atelier, hummed with pigments ground from lapis and gold leaf. Court chronicles such as the Shahnameh-i Suleiman married calligraphy to vivid vignettes, immortalizing campaigns, festivals, and courtly rituals. While Persian influences guided proportions and palette, Ottoman artists experimented with perspective and motion, creating an unmistakable style, lively, precise, and colored by Mediterranean blues. Poetry thrived as well. Suleiman himself wrote under the pen name Muhibbi, composing ghazals that blended Sufi metaphors with personal longing, some likely addressed to Harem. Court poets like Baki and Fuzuli polished the Ottoman Turkish language into a medium at once sensuous and philosophical, weaving Arabic and Persian loanwords into verses admired from Cairo coffeehouses to Bosnian madrasas. Scholarship, too, flourished. Endowed madrasas attracted jurists, astronomers, and physicians who debated Aristotle alongside Quranic exegesis. Taqi ad-Din, a court astronomer, constructed an observatory rivaling Tycho Brahe's in Denmark. There he calculated planetary motions, using mechanical clocks introduced through European contact, yet calibrated by Islamic trigonometric tables. Such cross-pollination typified the era. Merchants from Venice unloaded glassware beside spices from Aden. Jewish refugees from Iberia set up printing presses that multiplied texts once laboriously copied by hand. All these currents, architectural, literary, scientific, fed each other in a vibrant feedback loop echoed in the empire's provinces. In Damascus, caravanserais sheltered traders on the silk and spice roads. In Sarajevo, mosques with pencil-thin minarets announced the empire's northern reach. In Cairo, Ottoman governors restored Mamluk palaces while commissioning new fountains inscribed with Suleiman's Tugra, his stylized calligraphic signature. Thus, the Golden Age was gilded not merely in conquest, but in creativity. The marriage of Suleiman and Harem symbolized a union of devotion and power. Sinan's domes translated imperial ambition into geometry. Poets distilled experience into couplets that still whisper from fragile manuscripts. While later centuries would see this brilliance dim under the weight of war and debt, the 16th century's cultural efflorescence left a residue perceptible even today. In Istanbul's skyline, in Balkan folk music tinged with Ottoman melodies, and in legal codes from Tunisia to Greece that once echoed Suleiman's Kanun. When travelers of the era approached Istanbul by sea, they remarked that the city seemed to float, its domes like silver bubbles atop blue water. That illusion captured something essential. The Ottomans at their pinnacle conjured grandeur that felt simultaneously solid and weightless, earthly, yet lifted toward the divine. And at the heart of that vision stood a sultan poet, his redoubtable queen, and an empire convinced, if only for a generation, that beauty, justice, and power could share the same horizon. At the very heart of Ottoman power, rising like a gilded crown above the hills of Istanbul, stood Topkapi Palace. From the outside, it seemed less a palace in the Western sense and more a city within a city. A carefully arranged network of courtyards, halls, gardens, kitchens, and quarters that overlooked the meeting of 2 continents at the Bosphorus Strait. It was here, behind walls of stone and etiquette, that the rhythm of Ottoman rule found its pulse. Topkapi was not built as a single monumental structure, but as a series of layers, each more restricted than the last, like concentric circles of intimacy and power. The outermost courtyard bustled with activity. Traders, soldiers, petitioners, and craftsmen passed through its gates daily. Closer in, the second courtyard housed the imperial kitchens, capable of preparing meals for thousands, and the divan chamber, where the Grand Vizier and other ministers met in council. Still deeper lay the third courtyard, the inner palace, where the Sultan's private library, treasury, and sacred relics of Islam were kept. Here, only the most trusted eunuchs and advisors had access. Beyond this final veil, largely hidden from public eyes, was the harem. But before entering those quieter chambers, one must understand that Topkapi was not just the Sultan's residence. It was the nerve center of an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia. Every protocol had purpose. Every robe, cushion, or doorway served to establish hierarchy and control. Even silence was institutionalized. The famed Babu Sad, or Gate of Felicity, marked the transition from the administrative to the sacred private realms. It was at this gate that new Grand Viziers were appointed, where victorious generals kissed the Sultan's robe, and where imperial edicts, carried out through every Ottoman province, were ceremonially declared. Inside, the Sultan was surrounded not just by officials, but by entire branches of elite service. The palace school, or enderun, trained gifted boys, often selected through the Devshirme levy, in languages, governance, military arts, and even poetry. Many of these young men would rise to become governors, generals, and viziers. Merit mingled with loyalty, and Topkapi functioned not just as a dwelling, but as a factory of statecraft. And then, of course, there was the harem, a word that evokes opulence and secrecy, though its true role was far more complex than popular imagination suggests. Far from being a place of leisure or mere sensuality, the harem was a political institution. It was home to the Sultan's mother, wives, concubines, children, and their caretakers. It was managed with precision and hierarchy. At its head stood the Valid Sultan, the Queen Mother, who often wielded extraordinary influence over succession, court appointments, and diplomatic strategy. The harem's physical architecture reflected this structure. Its corridors branched into private rooms, baths, and teaching spaces. Young girls, often brought from various corners of the empire, were trained in literature, music, embroidery, etiquette, and sometimes languages. The most talented among them could rise through the ranks to become Haseki, chief consort, or even Kadın Efendi, imperial wife. Their position was not secured merely by beauty, but by intellect, discipline, and, most crucially, the ability to produce male heirs. One might think of the harem as a realm of soft power, an arena where quiet influence could determine loud outcomes. Many sultans relied heavily on the counsel of their mothers and consorts. Hürrem Sultan, as we've seen, rose from these same halls to reshape imperial politics. Her successors too left their mark. Kösem Sultan and Turhan Hatishe Sultan both governed as regents for underage heirs, issuing decrees and managing foreign relations with a skill that rivaled any vizier. In many ways, the palace and the harem mirrored one another. Topkapi's outer courtyards represented the formal world of governance. The harem reflected the internal logic of dynastic survival. The former dealt in wars and trade routes. The latter managed bloodlines, succession, and the invisible levers of preference and influence. Outside of formal politics, the harem also served as a cultural hearth. Its women commissioned mosques, fountains, schools, and charity kitchens throughout the empire. Through poetry, calligraphy, and architectural patronage, they participated in the artistic flowering of Ottoman society. Their voices, though rarely inscribed in state chronicles, echoed in marble and manuscript alike. At the center of it all was a paradox: immense power nested inside near-complete seclusion. The women of the harem rarely stepped beyond its walls, and yet their impact extended to Baghdad, Belgrade, and beyond. Through whispers, gifts, and meticulously timed alliances, they shaped the fate of empires from within gilded lattices. As one moved from the second courtyard to the third, from the divan hall to the harem's gardens, the air changed, quietude deepened, the carpets thickened, and time seemed to slow. In this inner sanctum, away from the clang of swords and roar of cannons, the Ottoman Empire's most intimate decisions were debated, whispered, and finally enacted. In the chapters to come, we'll explore how this palace world connected to the wider Ottoman landscape, through trade, treaties, wars, and revolts. But here, in Topkapi's hidden rooms, the empire first breathed, blinked, and turned its face toward history. Within the Ottoman palace, few roles held as much silent authority as that of the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother. To outsiders, she was a figure shrouded in privacy, but inside the walls of Topkapi, she was second only to the Sultan himself. As the mother of the reigning Sultan, her influence rippled through the empire in subtle but powerful ways. She managed the inner politics of the harem, advised on matters of state, and often oversaw large charitable endowments that shaped the social fabric of Ottoman cities. The Valide Sultan's quarters were among the most lavish in the palace, reflecting not only her maternal bond to the Sultan, but also her political stature. She played a crucial role in managing the selection and promotion of concubines, mentoring the young women of the harem, and even offering counsel during succession crises. Her role was not ceremonial, it was strategic. She might serve as a mediator between rival court factions, protect her family's interests, and in certain cases, act as regent when the Sultan was too young or absent. During the Sultanate of Women era, in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Valide Sultan's influence reached its zenith. Figures like Nurbanu Sultan and Kösem Sultan not only shaped internal court life, but also played significant roles in diplomacy, infrastructure development, and religious patronage. They corresponded with European queens and ambassadors, oversaw the building of mosques and soup kitchens, and ensured dynastic continuity during periods of instability. Beyond politics, the Ottoman court was also a wellspring of artistic and intellectual flourishing. Poetry was considered one of the highest forms of expression, and both men and women at court composed verses that blended Persian elegance with Turkish clarity. Poetry recitations were common in the harem and among the Sultan's courtiers, often reflecting themes of love, longing, piety, and beauty. Even sultans like Suleiman the Magnificent wrote under pen names, producing deeply personal reflections on power and impermanence. Ottoman miniature painting, adapted from Persian traditions, reached a unique synthesis under imperial patronage. These delicate illustrations adorned manuscripts, chronicled battles, celebrated royal ceremonies, and depicted court life with vibrant detail. Though not intended for public display, these works were deeply valued within the court and served both as artistic treasures and historical records. Music, too, had its revered place in the palace. The military bands, with their crashing cymbals and booming drums, stirred soldiers on the battlefield, while in the court, more refined musical forms, using the ney flute, oud, and kanun, accompanied poetry readings, religious gatherings, and personal entertainment. Music was not limited to men. Some women of the harem became highly skilled musicians and teachers. And then there was the cuisine, rich, aromatic, and deeply symbolic. Ottoman food culture fused the flavors of the Balkans, the Middle East, and Anatolia into a refined, courtly tradition. At Topkapi, over 1,000 kitchen staff prepared feasts that featured rice pilafs, lamb stews, stuffed vegetables, and delicate sweets like baklava. Meals were served with an attention to hierarchy, presentation, and ritual. The palace's kitchens, housed in vast domed buildings, were architectural marvels in themselves, capable of feeding both the Sultan's household and large visiting delegations. Outside the palace, the blossoming of Ottoman urban culture could be felt most palpably in its kahvehan, the coffee houses. Emerging in the 16th century, these spaces became social hubs where men gathered to converse, listen to stories, play games like tavla, backgammon, and, of course, drink thick, unfiltered Turkish coffee. Despite periodic bans by religious conservatives who feared sedition and idleness, coffee houses became inseparable from Ottoman civic life. They fostered a kind of informal public sphere where ideas flowed as freely as the bitter brew itself. Equally esteemed was the art of calligraphy. In a culture that regarded the written word, especially Arabic script, as sacred, calligraphers were held in the highest regard. Their work adorned mosque domes, Qurans, imperial edicts, and even palace walls. Master calligraphers could spend years perfecting a single style, such as thuluth or naskh, and their creations were considered both religious devotion and aesthetic triumph. Another vital symbol of Ottoman culture was the carpet, not just a floor covering, but a canvas of meaning. Woven by hand in workshops across Anatolia and the Caucasus, Ottoman carpets carried motifs passed down through generations: stylized flowers, geometric stars, symbolic trees of life. They were used in homes, mosques, and even diplomatic gifts, admired for their craftsmanship and seen as a source of pride and piety. In all these forms, poetry, miniature painting, calligraphy, cuisine, and domestic art, the Ottomans cultivated a world of depth and elegance. This richness wasn't confined to the palace alone. It permeated marketplaces, mosques, and homes throughout the empire. Through the queen mothers who influenced courts, through the poems whispered in candle-lit gardens, and through the thick aroma of coffee in tiled courtyards, the culture of the Ottoman Empire lived and breathed far beyond its conquests. This vibrant cultural life, rooted in diversity, artistic excellence, and complex social roles, stood as one of the great legacies of the Ottoman world. In the next chapter, we will follow how this inner brilliance reached outward, shaping global diplomacy, trade, and conflict across 3 continents. As the Ottoman Empire matured into a formidable power in the 16th century, its ambitions stretched far beyond Anatolia and the Balkans. Under the leadership of sultans like Selim I and Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans expanded into the heartlands of Islam, the lucrative coastlines of North Africa, and the contested terrains of Eastern Europe. This expansion was not just a feat of military prowess, it was a carefully calculated strategy that blended warfare, religious legitimacy, and diplomatic cunning. In the early 1500s, the Ottomans turned their gaze toward Arabia. Selim I, known as Selim the Grim, launched a campaign that culminated in the conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt in 1517. With this single victory, the Ottomans took control of Cairo, the cultural jewel of the Arab world, and with it, the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina. This acquisition granted the Ottoman sultans the title of custodian of the two holy mosques, a designation that imbued the empire with immense religious prestige among the Sunni Muslim world. The Hijaz region was administered with respect and relative autonomy, as the Ottomans saw themselves not merely as conquerors, but as protectors of Islam's holiest sites. Further west, Ottoman fleets, under admirals like the legendary Hayreddin Barbarossa, established dominance over much of the North African coast. Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli became Ottoman provinces or client states, providing naval bases and extending Ottoman reach into the Mediterranean. These coastal strongholds served as bulwarks against Spanish and Portuguese encroachments and also as launch pads for corsair activity, state-sanctioned piracy that blurred the line between naval warfare and economic raiding. To the north and east, the Ottomans steadily advanced into Eastern Europe. The conquest of Hungary, following the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, opened the door to Central Europe, bringing Ottoman armies to the gates of Vienna. While the siege of Vienna in 1529 would ultimately fail, it marked the zenith of Ottoman territorial expansion in Europe and left an enduring mark on the continent's political and religious landscape. Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania often functioned as vassal states, caught between submission and rebellion, yet still part of the broader Ottoman orbit. These expansions brought the Ottomans into frequent contact and often conflict with major regional powers. To the east, the Safavid Empire of Persia emerged as a formidable Shia Muslim rival. The Ottomans, staunchly Sunni, clashed repeatedly with the Safavids in a series of wars marked not only by military intensity, but by deep sectarian hostility. The Battle of Chaldiran in 1514 was a pivotal Ottoman victory, allowing Selim I to secure eastern Anatolia and assert dominance over key Kurdish principalities. Yet the Safavid threat persisted for centuries, shaping Ottoman military deployments and frontier policies well into the 17th century. In Egypt and Syria, the Ottomans absorbed the Mamluk elite into their administrative structure after the conquest, transforming what had once been a fierce rival into a crucial pillar of their imperial governance. Former Mamluk officers were integrated as provincial governors, and Cairo remained a center of Islamic learning and commerce, albeit now under Ottoman rule. This approach, pragmatic rather than punitive, helped stabilize the newly acquired territories and preserved the cultural vibrancy of the region. On the Western Front, Europe posed a far more complex set of challenges. Relations with Christian kingdoms and empires were marked by a mixture of warfare, trade, and diplomacy. Treaties were signed with France as early as the 1530s, with the so-called Franco-Ottoman alliance, allowing for mutual naval support against the Habsburgs. Venice, ever the maritime trader, maintained a tenuous peace punctuated by commercial agreements and occasional skirmishes. The Habsburgs themselves, ruling Austria and Spain, were the Ottomans' principal European rivals, battling the empire from Hungary to the Mediterranean. Control over trade routes was as critical as any battlefield victory. The Ottomans' grip on the eastern Mediterranean allowed them to dominate key segments of the Silk Road, particularly those routes that passed through Aleppo, Damascus, and Cairo. Goods from China and India, silk, spices, porcelain, flowed through Ottoman territory on their way to Europe. Likewise, Ottoman control of Red Sea ports and connections with Indian Ocean traders gave them an upper hand in the spice trade. This economic control was both a source of wealth and a reason for European states, like Portugal and later the Dutch and British, to search for alternate sea routes to the east. The Ottomans understood the value of these trade networks and invested heavily in their upkeep. Caravansaries dotted major routes, offering protection and lodging to merchants. Taxes were levied, but with enough predictability to foster thriving markets. The empire's ports, Izmir, Alexandria, Basra, buzzed with commerce, drawing merchants from across the globe and making the Ottomans indispensable middlemen in early modern global trade. Through conquest, diplomacy, and strategic trade, the Ottomans maintained a vast and interconnected empire that spanned 3 continents. It was an empire deeply entangled with the broader world, often as a feared adversary, sometimes as a coveted ally, and always as a dominant force at the intersection of East and West. In the next section, we'll explore how this vast reach began to fray from within as succession crises and internal stagnation set the stage for the empire's gradual decline. As the Ottoman Empire expanded across continents and commanded attention on the global stage, its diplomacy evolved into a sophisticated tool of statecraft. While military might had carved the empire's path through Arabia, North Africa, and the Balkans, it was diplomacy that allowed the Ottomans to negotiate, influence, and sometimes manipulate the European powers that both feared and admired them. Among the most enduring diplomatic relationships forged by the Ottomans was their alliance with France. In the 1530s, a groundbreaking and controversial treaty was signed between Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and King Francis I of France. The 2 leaders, though divided by religion, shared a common adversary, the Habsburg dynasty. The Franco-Ottoman alliance was a shrewd geopolitical partnership that shocked Europe. For the first time, a Christian kingdom had formally aligned itself with a Muslim empire, not in a fleeting battlefield truce, but in a long-term mutual understanding. This alliance allowed French ships privileged access to Ottoman ports, and in return, Ottoman forces occasionally supported French interests against Habsburg power. It wasn't merely a political move, it was also deeply economic. French merchants received capitulations, favorable trading rights within Ottoman lands, which gave them competitive advantage over other European traders. These capitulations would become a model for future European dealings with the empire and would, in time, evolve into a complex system of foreign privileges that outlived their original intent. Venice, the merchant republic of the Adriatic, held a different but equally significant role. Unlike France, Venice was both a trading partner and a frequent adversary. For centuries, the Ottomans and Venetians danced between war and peace, their rivalry often focused on control of the eastern Mediterranean and vital islands such as Crete and Cyprus. Treaties were drawn and redrawn, with terms frequently altered depending on the tides of battle. Yet Venetian merchants continued to flourish in Ottoman ports, and Istanbul's bazaars often echoed with the sounds of Italian as much as Turkish or Arabic. Then there were the Habsburgs, rulers of Austria and Spain, who stood as the Ottomans' most formidable European rivals. The Ottoman-Habsburg rivalry was defined not by treaties of friendship, but by nearly constant warfare. Border regions in Hungary, Croatia, and Transylvania were the frequent sites of skirmishes, shifting allegiances, and castle sieges. Diplomatic envoys did pass between Istanbul and Vienna, but usually in the context of ceasefires or prisoner exchanges, rather than alliance building. The tension between the two powers would come to define the frontier politics of Central Europe for centuries. The pinnacle of this rivalry was reached in the dramatic events surrounding the two sieges of Vienna in 1529 and 1683. The first siege, led by Suleiman the Magnificent, marked the high watermark of Ottoman power in Europe. After victories in Hungary and the Balkans, Suleiman's forces marched westward and encircled Vienna. The city's defences were hastily prepared, and while the Ottomans brought massive artillery and thousands of troops, the siege ultimately failed due to logistical constraints, poor weather, and the defenders' resilience. Though unsuccessful, the attempt sent a powerful message. The Ottomans were not just a regional power, they were a threat at the very heart of Europe. Over 150 years later, the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683 proved to be even more decisive, but this time to the empire's detriment. Led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, the Ottomans once again amassed a great army and set their sights on Vienna. Yet this campaign lacked the strategic brilliance of Suleiman's era. The siege dragged on, and the Ottomans found themselves encircled when a coalition of European forces, led by Polish King John III Sobieski, launched a surprise counterattack. The Ottomans were decisively defeated, and the battle became a turning point, not only for the Ottomans, but for the trajectory of European geopolitics. After 1683, the Ottomans would never again threaten the core of Europe with such might. The myth of Ottoman invincibility, so carefully cultivated over centuries, began to unravel. The Habsburgs pushed southward, reclaiming Hungarian territories. Treaties like the Treaty of Karlowitz, 1699, formalized these losses, ceding vast tracts of land and signaling a shift in power. Still, even as military fortunes changed, Ottoman diplomacy adapted. Ambassadors from Istanbul were dispatched to European courts, and European envoys were welcomed with ceremony in the Ottoman capital. These diplomatic exchanges were not only political, but cultural. Language, art, attire, and protocol were all exchanged in subtle, symbolic gestures. The Ottomans were no longer the dominant force they had been during Suleiman's time, but they remained a critical player in the balance of power. Thus, the Ottoman Empire reached its geopolitical zenith on the plains before Vienna, and began its long descent from that very same field. The sieges marked both ambition and overreach, strength and vulnerability. What followed would be an internal reckoning, as the empire began to confront not just its enemies abroad, but its stagnation within. In the next chapter, we journey inward, to the halls of power and the cracks that had begun to show behind the imperial facade. As the 17th century progressed, the Ottoman Empire, once feared and admired across 3 continents, began to show signs of fatigue. The grandeur of Suleiman's reign had faded into memory, and in its place emerged an era marked by internal disarray, political stagnation, and a slow unraveling of the structures that once made the empire formidable. The causes of this long decline were many, but it often began at the very heart of power, within the palace walls. The Ottoman court, particularly after the death of strong rulers like Suleiman, became a crucible of intrigue and manipulation. The once orderly succession system, where a new sultan would assert dominance by eliminating his rivals, gradually gave way to a system riddled with indecision. Instead of being trained in governance or the battlefield, many princes were now kept in luxurious confinement within the palace, a practice known as the cafes or the cage. Here, would-be sultans were cut off from the world, surrounded only by eunuchs and tutors, and left without the experience needed to lead a sprawling empire. When these secluded princes eventually ascended the throne, many proved indecisive or overly reliant on court advisors. These sultans lacked the political acumen or military flair of their ancestors, and their reigns were often dominated by powerful court factions, chief among them the Grand Viziers, the Janissaries, and the imperial Harem, particularly the Valid Sultan, or Queen Mother. It was a time when whispers in silk-draped corridors determined policy as much as council chambers did. The Janissaries, once elite shock troops raised through the Devshirme system, had by now become a potent political force, but also a deeply corrupt one. No longer composed strictly of converted Christian youths loyal to the Sultan, the Janissary Corps had begun admitting men through bribes and nepotism. Their military discipline eroded, and they increasingly involved themselves in politics, often toppling sultans or enforcing their own will through threats of rebellion. The very institution that had once propelled the Ottomans to power now helped accelerate their decline. This domestic instability translated into weakening military performance. The Ottomans found it increasingly difficult to hold their ground in Europe, especially against the rising power of the Habsburgs and the expanding might of the Russian Empire. The previously feared Ottoman army suffered significant defeats in a series of wars across the Balkans and the Caucasus. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, for example, saw the empire lose large portions of Hungary and Transylvania, a symbolic blow that marked the end of Ottoman territorial expansion in Europe. At the same time, the decentralized nature of Ottoman governance, which had once allowed for local autonomy and flexibility, began to work against the empire's cohesion. Provincial governors, or beys, who were once accountable to the central government, started acting with increasing independence. In some regions, such as Egypt and Iraq, these local rulers became semi-autonomous, collecting taxes and maintaining armies with little interference from Istanbul. As the state's capacity to enforce central control waned, regional power bases hardened, and the empire's vast territories began to slip from effective imperial grasp. Corruption seeped into the administrative machinery as well. Tax farming, a system where individuals could purchase the right to collect taxes in a region, became widespread. While lucrative for the central treasury in the short term, this practice often led to exploitation and resentment among the local populations. The absence of consistent oversight allowed tax farmers to enrich themselves at the expense of peasants and merchants, further alienating the subjects of the empire from its rulers. Economic difficulties compounded the decline. The old Silk Road and spice trade routes, once under Ottoman control, had lost much of their value as European maritime powers opened up sea routes around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. This undercut the empire's economic leverage and shifted global trade away from its domains. Inflation, debasement of currency, and reliance on foreign merchants further destabilized the internal economy. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and stagnation, even cultural life, once so vibrant, began to dull. Patronage of the arts declined, and intellectual life became increasingly conservative. While there were still scholars, poets, and architects at work, the dazzling innovations of the Suleimanic era gave way to repetition and formality. Yet this was not a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion. The Ottoman Empire remained a powerful force in name, but its inner workings had become brittle. The once unified vision of a sultanate ordained by divine favor and maintained by administrative excellence was now clouded by factionalism, inertia, and a growing gap between center and periphery. And so, by the dawn of the 18th century, the Ottoman world was a paradox, still vast, still majestic on the surface, but increasingly hollowed out from within. The next chapter in its long journey would attempt revival, experimentation, and encounters with modernity, experiments that would shake the foundations of empire even further. As the embers of Ottoman greatness cooled, the early 18th century offered a curious moment of serenity and reinvention, one remembered as the Tulip Era, Lal Devri. Spanning roughly from 1718 to 1730, during the reign of Sultan Ahmed III, this was a time of partial peace and cultural flourishing, when the Ottoman court turned inward, enchanted by refinement, leisure, and the aesthetics of European art and architecture. It was named for the humble tulip, whose exotic beauty captured the imagination of the imperial elite and became a symbol of elegance and transience. The tulip era was more than just an indulgence in floral motifs. It marked an early, tentative embrace of westernization. Following years of exhausting wars and internal decay, the Ottomans sought inspiration from European courts, especially France. Embassies were dispatched to Paris, and returning dignitaries brought tales of coffee salons, printing presses, and secular science. Grand Vizier Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha championed reforms. Fountains and pleasure gardens were built across Istanbul, reflecting the Rococo tastes of the age. Western dress began to appear in courtly fashion. And in 1727, the empire's first printing press for Arabic script books was established under the supervision of Ibrahim Müteferrika, a Hungarian convert to Islam and polymath. Yet beneath the ornate surface of this cultural blossoming, tensions simmered. The reforms were largely confined to the capital and the ruling elite, leaving vast rural and military segments of the population untouched or resentful. The Janissaries once again emerged as both a symptom and a cause of the empire's internal weakness. By this period, they had grown into an undisciplined political bloc, far removed from their origins as elite, state-trained warriors. Their role had shifted from loyal soldiers to power brokers, often resisting reform to protect their privileges. Many Janissaries took up trades and businesses in the cities, further blurring the line between military and civilian life. Their unchecked power bred corruption, and their involvement in palace politics and urban commerce allowed them to block or reverse any attempts to modernize the military. Sultans and viziers who attempted to introduce European-style military training or new technologies often faced Janissary uprisings. This resistance to change would cost the Ottomans dearly in the years to come. Outside the capital, a similar erosion of central authority was underway. The empire's vast size had always required delegation to regional governors, but now, in the absence of strong sultanic oversight, many of these ayans, local notables and military commanders, began consolidating personal power. Some of them built private armies, collected taxes independently, and ruled like petty kings in their territories. While technically loyal to the Sultan, they were, in practice, semi-autonomous. This decentralization fractured the empire's unity, especially in the Arab provinces and the Balkans, where long-standing local rivalries resurfaced. The Ottomans, weakened internally, also faced growing pressure from without. Chief among these threats were the Russians to the north. The Russo-Turkish Wars, a series of brutal conflicts stretching from the late 17th to the 19th centuries, drained Ottoman resources and morale. Russia, under leaders like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, was expanding southward with determination, seeking warm water ports and dominance over the Black Sea. The Ottomans, ill-prepared and slow to adapt militarily, found themselves repeatedly pushed back. One of the most devastating episodes came in the War of 1768 to 1774. The Russian Navy's surprise appearance in the Mediterranean and the Ottoman defeat at the Battle of Kozluga laid bare the imbalance of power. The Treaty of Küçük 1774, forced the Ottomans to cede territory, grant independence to the Crimean Khanate, soon annexed by Russia, and significantly allow Russia the right to intervene on behalf of Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, a clause that would haunt the empire for generations. Similarly, on the empire's western front, Austria posed a formidable challenge. The Habsburgs, allied with Russia, repeatedly seized Ottoman lands in the Balkans. The Battle of Zenta in 1697, led by Prince Eugene of Savoy, was a humiliating defeat that exposed the growing vulnerability of Ottoman forces. The Austrians captured Belgrade, and subsequent treaties saw the empire steadily losing its European holdings. These military defeats were not just territorial setbacks. They eroded the psychological foundation of Ottoman supremacy. The old notion that the empire was divinely ordained and militarily invincible began to collapse. Confidence waned. Reformers struggled to act, constrained by entrenched interests, while conservatives clung to a nostalgic vision of an empire that no longer existed. By the end of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire remained vast on maps, but hollowed out by misrule, military humiliation, and deepening internal fractures. The seeds of reform had been sown in the Tulip era, but the empire lacked the will and unity to pursue them vigorously. In the chapters to come, this tension between the need for change and the fear of it would define the Ottoman struggle for survival in a world that was rapidly modernizing. The dawn of the 19th century arrived not with quiet continuity, but with thunderous disorientation. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte, a name yet unfamiliar to the Ottomans but soon etched in imperial anxiety, launched a bold invasion of Egypt, a prized Ottoman province. This event, swift and deeply unsettling, pierced the Ottoman sense of security and forced the Sublime Porte to confront the stark truth. The balance of global power had shifted. Egypt, for centuries governed by a combination of Ottoman-appointed governors and semi-independent Mamluk elites, was both a cultural jewel and a critical strategic hub. Napoleon's landing in Alexandria and subsequent victories across the Nile Delta revealed the vulnerabilities of the Ottoman military structure. French forces, though eventually driven out by the combined efforts of the British Navy and Ottoman forces, had exposed the sclerotic state of Ottoman defences, the backwardness of their military command, and the fragile state of regional loyalty. For many Ottoman observers, the invasion signalled not just an external threat, but an internal reckoning. The French incursion was also ideological. With Napoleon came the trappings of Enlightenment thought, scientific instruments, scholars, printers, and a self-assured belief in Western superiority. This intellectual invasion left behind more than just ruins. It planted seeds of reform, anxiety, and re-evaluation across Ottoman intellectual circles. Though deeply Muslim and rooted in Islamic political traditions, the Ottoman elite could no longer ignore the growing gap between their institutions and those of an increasingly industrialized, centralized Europe. This shockwave rippled outward into the wider provinces of the empire, especially the Balkans, a region already simmering with discontent. Throughout the 19th century, the Balkans transformed from the imperial borderlands of a grand Islamic polity into a powder keg of national aspirations. Serbs, Greeks, Bulgarians, Romanians, and Albanians, many of them Orthodox Christians or Catholics, began to organize, resist, and dream of independence. The Serbian revolt, which erupted in 1804, marked the beginning of this long and bloody unraveling. Initially sparked by abuses at the hands of local Janissary officials, it evolved into a broader nationalist movement under leaders like Karađorđe Petrović. Though the first rebellion was crushed, the Second Serbian Uprising in 1815 succeeded in securing autonomous status for Serbia under Ottoman suzerainty. It was a harbinger of what lay ahead. The Greek War of Independence, launched in 1821, shook the Ottoman world to its core. Greece held symbolic weight not only for European powers, who romanticized ancient Athens and Sparta, but also for the Ottomans, who saw it as a vital part of their imperial fabric. The war, brutal and prolonged, was marked by atrocities on both sides. European sympathy for the Greeks, inflamed by the writings of poets like Lord Byron, who died fighting alongside Greek rebels, turned political. By 1827, Britain, France, and Russia intervened directly at the Battle of Navarino, sinking the Ottoman Egyptian fleet and forcing the empire to concede Greek independence by 1832. These nationalist uprisings were not isolated incidents. They were reflections of a tectonic shift, the rise of nationalism across Europe, fueled by Enlightenment ideals, the printing press, and a growing sense of linguistic and cultural identity, was fundamentally incompatible with the Ottoman model of multi-ethnic, religiously layered imperial governance. The empire, which had long maintained peace through a careful system of millets, religious communities with semi-autonomous legal rights, was ill-equipped to deal with movements that demanded not autonomy, but sovereignty. Worse still, these rebellions often found enthusiastic support from rival European powers eager to carve away pieces of the Ottoman realm. Russia, invoking its role as protector of Orthodox Christians, repeatedly intervened in Balkan affairs, pressing southward with each war. Austria, too, eyed the crumbling frontiers with interest, and even Britain and France, though at times supporting Ottoman integrity to preserve the balance of power, also wielded influence in the region to their own benefit. As the 19th century progressed, Ottoman rulers faced a bitter reality. Their empire was being both physically and ideologically dismantled from within and without. Each successful rebellion inspired the next. Even among Muslim populations, like the Albanians and later the Arabs, the seeds of identity and autonomy began to stir. To counter this disintegration, the Ottomans would launch a sweeping campaign of reform known as the Tanzimat, a topic to be explored in the next part of the chapter. But for now, standing in the early decades of the 1800s, the empire appeared to be bleeding from 1,000 cuts, staggered by invasion, destabilized by rebellion, and shadowed by the winds of modern nationalism that would not cease. As the Ottoman Empire reeled from the shock of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign and began to grasp the implications of its military and administrative decline, the early 19th century ushered in an era of relentless internal challenges, none more consequential than the nationalist uprisings in the Balkans. These revolts, far from fleeting rebellions, revealed the deep fault lines within an empire that had long relied on diversity as its strength, but now struggled to contain rising demands for independence. The Serbian revolt, which had begun in 1804, returned with greater strength in 1815. This second Serbian uprising, led by Miloš Obrenović, was more tactically cautious but politically savvy. Unlike earlier efforts that sought immediate independence through force, Obrenović worked through negotiation and limited confrontation. By 1830, the Ottoman Empire formally recognized Serbia as an autonomous principality, though still nominally under Ottoman suzerainty. This moment marked the first successful carving out of national identity from the imperial body, a quiet but decisive beginning of the Ottoman retreat from the Balkans. Meanwhile, the Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1832, ignited with greater cultural and international resonance. Greeks had long enjoyed prominence within the Ottoman administration and Orthodox Church hierarchy, but nationalistic aspirations, fueled by Enlightenment ideals and diaspora support, grew stronger with time. The Philiki Eteria, a secret nationalist society, plotted revolt, and when revolution erupted in the Peloponnese and the Aegean, it was met with brutal Ottoman suppression. Yet the global stage had shifted. Western Europe viewed the Greek cause as not only a struggle for independence, but a romantic resurrection of classical civilization. The participation of figures like Lord Byron and the support of Philhellenic societies galvanized public opinion across Britain, France, and Russia. These powers did more than sympathize. The pivotal Battle of Navarino in 1827, in which a combined European fleet destroyed the Ottoman Egyptian navy, effectively sealed the fate of Ottoman control. By 1832, Greece was recognized as an independent kingdom. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Christendom, had now lost one of its most symbolic holdings to Christian Europe. Faced with growing instability, military humiliation, and mounting administrative decay, the Ottoman elite turned inward. Reform was no longer a question of ambition, it was a necessity for survival. The Tanzimat, or reorganization, reforms launched in 1839 under Sultan Abdülmecid, marked the most concerted effort to modernize the empire since its golden age. The Tanzimat reforms spanned nearly 4 decades and touched nearly every aspect of governance. The Gulhan Edict of 1839, often seen as the opening salvo, promised security of life, property, and honor for all subjects, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. It pledged to overhaul tax collection, conscription, and judicial fairness. For the first time, the state envisioned a more equal, centralized citizenship under a codified legal structure. These ideals expanded in the Islahat Edict of 1856, which guaranteed religious equality in civil affairs and permitted non-Muslims to serve in the military and access higher office. The education system was reformed to include secular schools, a civil service academy was established, and new commercial and criminal codes, based on European models, were introduced. The empire also saw its first attempts at constitutional governance with the 1876 constitution, though it was short-lived. These changes were not merely cosmetic. Railways were built, telegraphs installed, and newspapers began to flourish. Modern ministries replaced older palace departments. Istanbul, Cairo, and Beirut started to resemble European metropolises, at least in facade and form. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The Tanzimat reforms, while progressive in spirit, alienated both conservative elements of Ottoman society and certain minority communities. Many Muslims saw these reforms as a betrayal of Islamic values and a concession to European imperialism. The integration of non-Muslims into public institutions, especially the military, was particularly controversial. Religious scholars, ulama, long guardians of Islamic law and tradition, found their influence increasingly marginalized by secular legal codes and Western-style institutions. Moreover, while the reforms promised equality, they did not always deliver it. Local resistance, corruption, and uneven implementation meant that many provinces continued to operate as they had before. For Christians in the Balkans, promises of inclusion were not enough to quell aspirations for autonomy. For conservative Muslims, the sight of Christian bureaucrats and judges issuing rulings over Muslims felt deeply unsettling. Thus, the Tanzimat paradox was clear. The empire sought unity through reform, but in doing so, it often deepened divisions. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire stood transformed but embattled. It had taken bold steps toward modern governance, but had awakened powerful currents of resistance, both nationalist and religious. Reform had bought time, but not peace. The empire's foundations were cracking, not only at its territorial edges, but within the very idea of what the Ottoman state was supposed to be: a house of Islam, a protector of diversity, and now a struggling modern state trying to balance its soul between past and future. By the mid to late 19th century, the once formidable Ottoman Empire found itself enmeshed in a web of European ambitions, a fragile giant struggling to maintain its dignity in an era defined by rising imperialism and nationalism. While Ottoman sultans still held vast lands stretching from the Balkans to Arabia, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The empire, once feared for its armies and admired for its administration, was now known by a sobering moniker, the sick man of Europe, a term reportedly coined by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia. It captured both the fading glory of the empire and the predatory attention it attracted from European powers eager to divide its remains. Ottoman diplomacy in this era increasingly resembled a game of survival rather than strategy. The empire no longer dictated terms, it reacted to them. European powers, Britain, France, Russia, Austria, Hungary, and later Germany, treated the Ottoman state less as an equal and more as a buffer, a landmass whose continued existence was tolerated only so far as it served their competing interests. The Ottoman court maintained a sophisticated foreign office and continued to send emissaries across Europe, but behind every treaty or alliance loomed the threat of territorial loss. This reality became painfully clear in the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. Egypt, long a crown jewel in the Ottoman dominion, slipped through its fingers not through war, but through a series of strategic humiliations. In 1705, Muhammad Ali, an Albanian officer in the Ottoman army, had wrested control of Egypt during a chaotic power vacuum. Though nominally loyal to the Sultan, Muhammad Ali governed independently, establishing his own dynasty and initiating sweeping reforms. His reign saw industrialization, a modern army, and expansive educational reforms, all while the Ottomans retained little more than ceremonial authority over the province. By the time the Suez Canal opened in 1869, Egypt had become a geopolitical prize. Crippled by debt, the Egyptian Khedive sold his shares in the canal to the British in 1875. Just a few years later, Britain would occupy Egypt entirely in 1882 under the pretense of restoring order, effectively transforming it into a protectorate. Although it remained technically under Ottoman sovereignty until World War I, the reality was that Egypt, once a breadbasket and administrative center, had been lost. In the West, the story was much the same. France, eager to assert its imperial influence in Africa, seized Algeria in 1830 after a flimsy pretext involving an unpaid debt and a diplomatic insult. Despite fierce local resistance, the French gradually extended their control, and by the 1840s, Algeria was a full colonial possession. The Ottomans, unable to mount any meaningful resistance, watched one of their oldest provinces vanish. Tunisia followed suit. In 1881, France once again capitalized on internal instability, declaring a protectorate over Tunisia with little regard for Ottoman protests. Just a year later, Italy set its sights on Libya, the last remaining Ottoman province in North Africa. Though the conquest of Libya would not be finalized until the Italo-Turkish War of 1911 to 1912, the writing was on the wall. One by one, the empire's Mediterranean territories, strategically vital and economically rich, were stripped away. These losses were not merely geographic. They symbolized the unraveling of the Ottoman position as a world power. Each province lost to European control exposed weaknesses in military readiness, administrative cohesion, and diplomatic leverage. Moreover, these defeats emboldened nationalist movements across the empire. If Egypt, Algeria, and Tunisia could become independent or fall under European guardianship, why not Syria? Why not the Balkans? Internally, the empire was reeling from the psychological toll. In Istanbul, the Sublime Porte attempted to project resilience. New ministries were established, railways constructed, and a semblance of constitutional governance was periodically revived. Yet behind the walls of Topkapi and later Dolmabahce Palace, a sense of desperation grew. The Ottoman state could modernize, but it could not control the speed or direction of change. The phrase "sick man" may have been coined in sarcasm, but it came to describe more than just the weakening of the state. It reflected a broader reality, that the Ottomans were being excluded from the very narrative of modern Europe that they had helped shape for centuries. They were no longer feared rivals or respected peers. They were legacy, not presence, memory, not power. As the 20th century approached, the Ottoman Empire still stretched across 3 continents, but it did so tenuously. Diplomacy was dictated by the whims of European capitals, and sovereignty over its own provinces was increasingly theoretical. The losses of Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya were not isolated tragedies. They were emblems of a slow imperial exhalation, as the empire that had once cast long shadows over Vienna, Mecca, and Algiers now fought simply to retain its breath. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a fragile crossroads, internally fractured, externally pressured, and ideologically torn between reaction and reform. The empire's attempts at modernization in the 19th century through the Tanzimat reforms had brought glimpses of progress, but had failed to address the deeper structural and social fissures threatening its stability. Amidst this uncertainty, a new generation of reformers emerged, the Young Turks. The Young Turks were not a single unified group, but a coalition of military officers, exiled intellectuals, bureaucrats, and students. What bound them together was a shared belief in the urgent need to restore the Ottoman constitution of 1876, limit the powers of the Sultan, and implement political modernization. Many of them had been influenced by European ideas, liberalism, secular nationalism, and the constitutionalism of countries like France and Italy. These ideas percolated through Ottoman society, especially among the educated elite, who saw the empire's decline not as inevitable, but as a result of misgovernance and repression. At the heart of their opposition stood Sultan Abdulhamid II. Although he had come to power in 1876 as a constitutional monarch, he had swiftly suspended the very constitution he had sworn to uphold, citing the empire's vulnerability and external threats. What followed was a nearly 3-decade-long reign marked by paranoia, press censorship, an elaborate internal spy network, and centralized autocracy. Abdulhamid II's rule came to symbolize the empire's stagnation and the suffocation of political life. But the Sultan was not merely a tyrant, he was also a skilled statesman. He deftly balanced rival European powers, played on pan-Islamic sentiments to bolster his authority among Muslim populations, and invested in infrastructure like the Hejaz Railway. Still, his reign did little to ease the empire's growing internal tensions. Ethnic minorities, Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, Kurds, Jews, and Slavs, each harbored grievances, and the idea of a cohesive Ottoman identity was eroding. The Young Turks, frustrated by Abdulhamid's absolutism, organized themselves into a revolutionary movement. Operating mostly from exile or clandestinely within the military, they established cells across Ottoman territories, most notably within the Third Army in Macedonia, a region racked with unrest and ethnic tensions. In 1908, capitalizing on military dissatisfaction and widespread resentment, the Young Turks launched a successful coup. Abdulhamid was forced to restore the 1876 constitution and recall the Ottoman parliament. It was hailed as the Second Constitutional Era, a beacon of hope for those yearning for reform and renewal. At first, the revolution sparked optimism. Political prisoners were released, the press flourished, and political parties proliferated. The Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, the most dominant faction within the Young Turks, took the reins of power. They promised a modern constitutional monarchy and unity among the empire's diverse ethnic and religious groups under the slogan "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity and Justice." Yet beneath this hopeful veneer, fractures began to widen. The CUP, once champions of democracy, increasingly leaned towards centralization and Turkification. Their commitment to equality often clashed with the realities of empire. Ethnic minorities, many of whom had initially supported the revolution, began to see the CUP as just another hegemonic force. Armenians hoped for autonomy. Arabs demanded greater representation. Albanians, Macedonians, and others sought national recognition. The CUP's solution was to push for a homogenized Ottoman identity, one that privileged Turkish language and culture, often at the expense of minority communities. Abdülhamid II, though stripped of most power, briefly returned to the political scene during the 1909 counter-coup known as the 31st March Incident, in which conservative and religious forces revolted against the CUP's secularizing agenda. The coup was short-lived. CUP loyalists suppressed the rebellion, and Abdülhamid was deposed and replaced by his brother Mehmed V. But the damage had been done. The coup and counter-coup revealed the deep ideological and sectarian rifts within Ottoman society. As the CUP tightened its grip on power in the following years, ethnic tensions escalated further. The Ottoman Balkans had long been a volatile region, and now nationalist uprisings grew more violent. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 would soon follow, and with them, catastrophic losses for the empire. In the empire's eastern provinces, Armenians began demanding reforms and protection from local abuses, only to be met with suspicion and repression. In Arab lands, intellectuals and tribal leaders started imagining futures beyond Ottoman rule. Meanwhile, Christian and Jewish communities felt increasingly alienated by the CUP's nationalist agenda. Thus, the years following the 1908 revolution marked both a dramatic political transformation and a tragic deepening of internal discord. The Young Turks had promised rejuvenation, but their vision proved narrow and their methods increasingly authoritarian. The Ottoman Empire entered the 20th century not as a united polity of diversity and reform, but as a patchwork of unrest, distrust, and competing dreams, each pulling away from the imperial center. The stage was set for the final acts of the empire's long story. What began as a revolution of promise would end in war, fragmentation, and unprecedented tragedy. Yet for a moment in 1908, the crescent once again seemed to rise, only to be obscured by the gathering storm. As the world spiraled into the abyss of the First World War in 1914, the Ottoman Empire found itself at a desperate crossroads. Once an empire that had straddled 3 continents, it was now diminished, disjointed, and increasingly regarded as the sick man of Europe. The empire's political leadership, still dominated by the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, and particularly the triumvirate of Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha and Shemal Pasha, believed war might offer an opportunity, not only to halt decline, but to reclaim lost glory and territory. Despite its weakened state, the Ottomans still occupied a strategically vital position, controlling the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, gateways between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. This alone made them a pivotal interest to both the Allied and Central powers. But internally, the empire was conflicted. Some leaders urged neutrality, fearing the ruin war would bring. Others, like Enver Pasha, Minister of War and one of the most influential figures in the KUP, leaned towards the Central powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, not only for their military strength, but also for ideological kinship in authoritarian modernization. In October 1914, the Ottoman Empire officially entered the war on the side of the Central powers. This decision was cemented when German warships operating under the Ottoman flag bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea. The Allies responded by declaring war, and the Ottomans suddenly found themselves entangled in a multi-front conflict that stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of the Caucasus and the shores of the Dardanelles. One of the most pivotal and dramatic episodes of the Ottoman experience in World War I was the Gallipoli campaign. The Allies, particularly Britain and France, hoped to strike a decisive blow by knocking the Ottomans out of the war early. Their plan: force a naval passage through the Dardanelles, capture Constantinople, and open a supply route to their Russian allies. It was an ambitious and bold strategy, born of both desperation and hubris. In March 1915, the Allied fleet launched its assault on the Dardanelles. But the straits were heavily mined, and Ottoman shore batteries, guided by skilled German officers and supplied with accurate artillery, dealt severe damage to the attacking fleet. When the naval operation stalled, the Allies resorted to a land invasion. On April 25, 1915, Allied troops, mainly composed of Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC, along with British and French forces, landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. What followed was a grueling and nightmarish campaign. The terrain was brutal: steep cliffs, narrow ridges, and rocky gullies. The Ottoman defenders, under the command of General Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, were well entrenched and fiercely determined. Kemal's leadership proved decisive. He anticipated Allied landing zones, inspired exhausted troops to hold their ground, and famously ordered his men, "I do not order you to fight, I order you to die." This stoic, almost sacrificial resolve became a hallmark of the Ottoman resistance. For months, the two sides fought a brutal stalemate. Disease, heat, poor sanitation, and insufficient supplies claimed thousands of lives. By the end of 1915, after suffering heavy losses and making little territorial gain, the Allies began their withdrawal. Gallipoli was a stunning Ottoman victory, perhaps the last great triumph of the empire, and an early sign of the leadership potential of Mustafa Kemal, whose legacy would transcend the war. Yet the Gallipoli success was not enough to reverse the tide of the wider conflict. The empire remained stretched thin. On the Eastern Front, Ottoman forces struggled against the Russians in Armenia. In Mesopotamia, British forces advanced steadily toward Baghdad. In Arabia, local tribes, encouraged and supported by the British, were rising in revolt. The empire was hemorrhaging resources and men, caught in a war that demanded more than it could give. Back in Istanbul, morale fluctuated between pride in victories like Gallipoli and despair over rising casualties, food shortages, and deepening political divisions. The Ottoman alliance with Germany brought military advisors and modern equipment, but it also drew the empire into battles that strained its already fragile fabric. Civilian life grew more difficult with each passing month, and the dreams of imperial restoration that had fueled the decision to go to war now faded into a grim struggle for survival. The Ottoman entry into World War I was a gamble, a last desperate attempt by its leaders to reverse a century of decline. Gallipoli may have offered a moment of defiance, a glimpse of the old glory, but it could not alter the trajectory of a state whose foundations were crumbling. The next phase of the war would expose even deeper wounds, both in the battlefield and in the soul of the empire, wounds that would ultimately prove fatal. As World War I raged across continents, the Ottoman Empire faced not only external pressure on the battlefield, but internal unraveling that would leave irreversible scars. Among the most devastating of these internal crises was the Armenian genocide, a deeply tragic and controversial chapter in modern history. In the shadow of war, the Ottoman government, led by the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, became increasingly paranoid about internal dissent and perceived betrayal. The Armenian population, a long-established Christian minority with a rich cultural and religious history in Anatolia, became the target of suspicion. Accusations circulated that Armenian nationalist groups were aiding the Russian enemy in the Caucasus front. Though some Armenians did side with the Russians, the majority remained loyal or neutral. Nevertheless, the Ottoman leadership viewed the entire population as a threat. In 1915, a systematic campaign of deportations, massacres, and starvation began. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians, men, women, and children, were forced from their homes and marched through the Syrian desert under brutal conditions. Many died of exposure, disease, or outright violence. Others were executed en masse in remote valleys and rivers. By the war's end, over 1 million Armenians were dead, and countless communities that had existed for centuries were erased from the map. The Ottoman government justified these actions as wartime necessity, alleging treason and rebellion, but many contemporary observers, including diplomats, missionaries, and journalists, recognized it as a deliberate act of extermination. Today, the Armenian genocide remains a point of global historical debate and political sensitivity, but for the descendants of the victims, it is an indelible wound and a testament to the destructive extremes of state paranoia and ethno-nationalism. The Armenian genocide was not the only internal tragedy. Other Christian minorities, such as Assyrians and Greeks, also faced persecution, displacement, and massacres. Meanwhile, within the empire, famine and disease swept through civilian populations, especially in regions like Lebanon and Anatolia, where wartime blockades and poor infrastructure led to widespread suffering. While the Ottoman heartland reeled from these crises, a powerful revolt was stirring in the Arabian Peninsula. The Arab Revolt, beginning in 1916, was both a political uprising and a symbolic rejection of Ottoman domination by Arab leaders who sought independence. Promises of post-war autonomy, offered by the British in secret correspondence, motivated tribal leaders, most notably Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his sons Faisal and Abdullah, to rise against Ottoman rule. The British, eager to weaken the Ottoman southern flank and secure their imperial interests, supported the revolt through both material aid and intelligence coordination. At the center of this collaboration was a young British officer, T.E. Lawrence, later known as Lawrence of Arabia. Fluent in Arabic and deeply immersed in the culture, Lawrence became both an advisor and a romanticized figure of rebellion. He assisted in guerrilla tactics, sabotage missions, and the eventual capture of key cities like Aqaba and Damascus. The Arab Revolt coincided with increasing pressure from British and French forces along the empire's outer territories. British troops advanced in Mesopotamia, capturing Baghdad in 1917. In Palestine, General Allenby marched into Jerusalem, marking the end of centuries of Ottoman rule. French forces moved through Syria and Lebanon. One by one, the Ottoman provinces outside Anatolia slipped away, either through military defeat or local rebellion. By 1918, with the war drawing to a close and the Central Powers crumbling, the final blow fell upon Istanbul itself. On October 30th, 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros with the Allies, effectively ending its participation in the war. Allied troops soon occupied key areas, including the capital. British, French, and Italian forces moved into Istanbul, marking the symbolic collapse of Ottoman sovereignty. In 1920, the humiliation was formalized with the signing of the Treaty of Sèvres. The treaty carved up the empire's territories among the victorious Allied powers. Armenia was granted independence. The Kurds were promised a homeland. Greece was awarded significant portions of western Anatolia. France took mandates over Syria and Lebanon, and Britain controlled Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. The treaty also sought to demilitarize the Ottoman heartland and internationalize the Bosphorus. For the Ottoman elite, the Treaty of Sèvres was more than a defeat. It was an existential death sentence. The empire that had stood for 6 centuries was reduced to a rump state, its sultan a powerless figurehead under foreign occupation. National humiliation and political chaos reigned in Istanbul, while the seeds of resistance began to stir in the heart of Anatolia. What had begun as a war to reclaim glory ended in fragmentation, tragedy, and foreign control. But even as the empire lay in pieces, new forces were rising, forces that would not accept the Treaty of Sèvres as the final chapter. The Ottoman world was dying, but the story of Turkey was about to begin. As the once mighty Ottoman Empire lay in fragments, occupied by Allied forces and stripped of its dominion through the Treaty of Sèvres, a new force began to stir in Anatolia. Out of the ashes of defeat, a movement was gathering, resolute, disciplined, and fiercely nationalist. At its helm stood a man who would reshape the destiny of the Turkish people. Mustafa Kemal, later honored with the title Atatürk, meaning Father of the Turks. Mustafa Kemal was no ordinary officer. He had distinguished himself during the Gallipoli campaign of World War I, where his leadership and strategic brilliance helped repel the Allied landings and earned him the admiration of the Ottoman military. But the defeat of the empire in the larger war, followed by the occupation of Istanbul and the imposition of the humiliating Sèvres Treaty, convinced him that the existing political order could no longer protect the Turkish nation. In 1919, while the Sultan's government in Istanbul remained paralyzed under foreign pressure, Mustafa Kemal arrived in Samsun on the northern coast of Anatolia. His mission, officially, was to oversee disarmament. In reality, it was the first step in organizing a national resistance. Over the following months, he rallied military officers, tribal leaders, and intellectuals to his cause. Through a series of congresses, first in Erzurum, then Sivas, he laid the foundation for a parallel government, one rooted in the will of the Turkish people rather than the decrees of the Ottoman court. This resistance quickly evolved into a full-fledged war of independence. Between 1919 and 1922, the Turkish national movement fought on multiple fronts, against Armenian forces in the east, French troops in the south, and most significantly, Greek armies in the west, who had advanced deep into Anatolia under Allied approval. The war culminated in the decisive Battle of Dumlupinar in August 1922, where the Turkish forces routed the Greek army, leading to a dramatic retreat toward the Aegean coast. Mustafa Kemal's leadership was strategic, but also symbolic. He emphasized national sovereignty, rejecting the old Ottoman reliance on dynastic rule and religious legitimacy. For him, the war was not just a military struggle, but a cultural and political rebirth. In 1920, the Grand National Assembly had been formed in Ankara, asserting itself as the true voice of the Turkish people, independent from the Sultan's regime. With victory secured and Ankara established as the new political center, the days of the Ottoman dynasty were numbered. On November 1st, 1922, the Grand National Assembly formally abolished the Sultanate. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI Vahideddin, departed Istanbul aboard a British warship, marking the end of over 6 centuries of dynastic rule. But the transformation did not stop there. Though the Sultanate had been dissolved, the Caliphate, a religious institution that claimed spiritual leadership over the Muslim world, remained, and with it, a lingering tie to Ottoman imperial identity. Mustafa Kemal saw the Caliphate as an obstacle to his vision of a modern, secular nation-state. To complete the revolution, he moved decisively. On March 3, 1924, the Turkish Grand National Assembly abolished the Caliphate, ending a legacy that traced back to the early Islamic centuries. The title of Caliph, once held by emperors commanding vast Islamic realms, was eliminated. Religious schools were brought under state control, religious courts were dissolved, and Islamic institutions that had served as pillars of Ottoman governance were dismantled. These reforms were not universally accepted. Many within Turkey and across the broader Muslim world mourned the end of the Caliphate, viewing it as the symbolic heart of Islamic unity. But for Mustafa Kemal, the dismantling of these institutions was essential to the creation of a new Turkish identity, one that was forward-looking, secular, and rooted in the sovereignty of the people rather than divine right or religious orthodoxy. By the mid-1920s, the Ottoman Empire, both politically and spiritually, was no more. In its place stood the Republic of Turkey, proclaimed in 1923, with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk as its first president. The capital was Ankara, not the once imperial Istanbul. The fez was banned, replaced with Western hats. Arabic script gave way to a Latin alphabet. The Quran was translated into Turkish, and women were granted rights unthinkable under previous regimes. The transition from empire to republic was not merely a change in governance, it was a transformation in the very conception of what it meant to be Turkish. The 600-year-old imperial order had ended, but its cultural and historical legacy lingered in architecture, language, cuisine, and memory. The road ahead would be turbulent, but the foundation had been laid. The Ottomans were gone, but Turkey, born from their ruins, would step into the modern world with a new voice and a bold vision. When the Republic shifted its capital inland to Ankara, many observers predicted that Istanbul, once Constantinople, the luminous prize of Mehmed II, would gradually fade into provincial quiet. Instead, the city thrived, freed at last from the heavy symbolism of imperial court ritual. Its skyline of slender minarets and swelling domes, its layered streets where Byzantine masonry meets Ottoman tilework, and its waterways humming with ferries continued to draw merchants, pilgrims, scholars, and dreamers. Hagia Sophia now spoke in a new secular register. The blue mosque glittered at dusk beside electric tram lines. The Grand Bazaar adapted to modern commerce while retaining the scent of centuries-old spice and leather. Istanbul became a meeting ground of continuity and change, where cafes in 19th-century arcades hosted Republican poets, where Jewish, Greek, Armenian, and Muslim neighborhoods reshaped their identities yet again, and where the Bosphorus still mirrored the passage of cargo ships linking Black Sea grain to global markets. In concert halls, Ottoman court music blended with European symphonies. In ateliers along Istiklal Avenue, calligraphers experimented with Latin script yet kept the lyrical flow of old divans alive. Without an emperor, the city remained an empire of memory, offering residents and visitors alike a living archive of 6 centuries in stone and song. The Ottoman approach to governance, its pragmatic layering of Islamic law, Sharia, with sultanic decrees, Kanun, and local custom, left a durable imprint across former provinces. Modern legal codes in Turkey, the Balkans, and much of the Arab world still echo Ottoman land registries, Vakıf pious endowment frameworks, and concepts of millet self-administration for religious minorities. In family law, in cadastral surveys, in the bureaucratic cadence of petitions and seals, traces of the imperial chancery survive. Culturally, Ottoman cuisine, its delicate pastries, layered pilafs, and coffee etiquette migrated with diasporas. So did musical modes like the makam, influencing everything from Greek rebetiko to Egyptian classical suites. Linguistically, Ottoman Turkish seeded loanwords into Bosnian, Bulgarian, Arabic dialects, and modern Hebrew, terms for furniture, fabrics, and even feelings of refined melancholy captured in the word huzun. Architecturally, the synthesis pioneered by Sinan and his successors, grand central domes supported by semi-domes, courtyards that breathe, fountains that murmur, became a template for civic beauty across 3 continents. Today, mosques in Sarajevo, Skopje, Damascus, and Cairo still anchor neighborhoods with silhouettes inspired by Istanbul's Süleymaniye and Selimiye complexes, caravanserais converted into boutique hotels, covered markets repurposed for contemporary art, and restored wooden Yala mansions along the Bosphorus all attest to an architectural language that balanced monumentality with human scale. Even outside former borders, Ottoman aesthetics left fingerprints. The Hungarian parliament's domed interior draws on Ottoman spatial rhythm, while tiled pavilions in Leningrad's Catherine Park nod to Iznik ceramics. Modern geopolitics in southeastern Europe and the Levant cannot be understood without the empire's administrative afterglow. The very map of the Balkans, its mix of Muslim, Orthodox, and Catholic populations woven through patchwork frontiers, is a legacy of centuries when Ottoman Timur cavalrymen settled on fertile plains and Orthodox monasteries received tax exemptions under imperial berats. Bosnia-Herzegovina's plural legal traditions, Kosovo's endowments, Bulgaria's minority frameworks, and Greece's border municipalities all reflect negotiations first handled in the Divan-ı Hümayun. In the Middle East, vilayet boundaries drawn in the 19th century Tanzimat era later guided European mandate borders. Iraq's 3 Ottoman vilayets of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, for example, became the core provinces of a modern state. Lebanon's confessional system echoes the Ottoman millet idea of communal autonomy, while Jordan's gendarmerie traces roots to late Ottoman desert patrols. Even the diplomatic art of balance through capitulations, once practiced with Venice and France, influenced how post-Ottoman states navigated unequal treaties with great powers. Beyond former territories, the Ottoman experience offers a case study in managing diversity, pragmatic tolerance when fiscally useful, coercive homogenization when authority felt threatened. Contemporary scholars exploring federalism, minority rights, or hybrid legal systems still mine Ottoman archives for precedents. The empire's postal routes became templates for transcontinental railways. Its coffeehouse culture seeded public spheres from Vienna to Damascus. Its endowment system inspires today's Islamic finance and charitable NGOs. Thus, while the Ottoman political structure dissolved in 1922, its resonance endures in the rhythms of Istanbul ferries, in legislative clauses across 5 nations, in melodies that drift from Sarajevo taverns to Cairo courtyards, and in the architectural grammar of domes that shelter worshippers and tourists alike. Like the call to prayer echoing over the Golden Horn at dawn, the empire's legacy is not a distant echo, but a living note, woven quietly into the daily lives of millions who, knowingly or not, still walk beneath the long shadow of the crescent that once rose in the east.